On the 18th of September 1982, Prince Rainier III of Monaco sat in the front pew of the Cathedral of Our Lady Immaculate in Monte Carlo and wept at his wife's state funeral in a way that European monarchs simply do not weep in public. Not the composed, hands folded, eyes just watering grief that protocol demands from heads of state on those occasions. The kind where someone has clearly rehearsed for being seen without fully breaking. Rainier wept the way grief actually operates when nothing is left to perform. His face came apart on camera in full view of the world's press. The footage is widely available and has been replayed in every documentary made about this woman in the 40 years since. If you watch it, you understand in roughly 30 seconds what the following 23 years of his life were going to look like. He had been ruling Monaco since 1949, 3 decades of learning to present himself as an absolute authority, a sovereign, a statesman who had pulled a failing principality back from the edge of French annexation by institutional force of will and careful political maneuvering. Geoffrey Robinson, who wrote the authorized biography of Rainier with the prince's direct cooperation over a sustained period, described the prince's management of his own public image as something very close to a practiced craft. Rainier understood cameras. He understood what they expected from a head of state at a state ceremony, and he had been meeting those expectations for 33 years. On September 18, 1982, none of it held. The question that drives this video is what kind of marriage produces that at its end. Because if you only know the Grace Kelly story in its most widely circulated version, the Oscar-winning actress who married a prince at a Riviera film festival and lived happily ever after in a palace above the Mediterranean, you have been sold something that accounts for, at most, about a third of what actually happened. The marriage of Grace Patricia Kelly to Rainier Louis Henri Maxence Bertrand Grimaldi ran 26 years, from April 1956 to September 1982. It produced 3 children. It produced a documented pattern of control over Grace's professional and personal movements that multiple serious biographers have catalogued from primary sources. It produced a career ending that Grace did not recognize as permanent until it was too late to change it. It produced a depression she carried for years and communicated to close friends in letters that survived her. It produced a body of philanthropic and artistic work that still operates today. It produced the sustained management of 3 complicated adult children simultaneously, during a period when the children's complications ran on overlapping timelines that would have exhausted anyone. It produced a gradual separation of 2 people into parallel lives inside the same palace, running through the final decade of the marriage, and a final 2 years in which the woman who had given up everything to become a princess was working harder at staying herself than she had at any point since she first walked into that palace at 26. That is the story the footage of Rainier weeping in the cathedral opens up. It takes 2.5 hours to tell honestly. Before we go anywhere, a word on sources, because this matters more than usual in a story that has attracted a remarkable volume of material that would not survive contact with a serious archive. The biographical industry around Grace Kelly contains tabloid accounts built on anonymous sourcing, posthumous psychological diagnoses assembled without medical records, and at least one major biography that has been fairly comprehensively dismantled by historians who actually worked with the primary material. The sources I draw on in this video are specific and named. Donald Spoto's 2009 work, High Society, The Life of Grace Kelly, which accessed the Kelly family archive in California, and remains the most carefully sourced study in this field. Judith Balaban Quine's 1989 memoir, The Bridesmaids, which is first-hand testimony from one of Grace's 6 closest American friends, a woman who stood at her side at the altar and maintained active correspondence with her for the rest of Grace's life. Geoffrey Robinson's Rainier and Grace, drawn on direct cooperation with the prince and his household staff. Robert Lacey's biography, which engages the documentary record more carefully and skeptically than most, and Geoffrey Robinson's authorized biography of Rainier himself, for which the prince cooperated over a sustained period, and which includes, remarkably, frank descriptions of aspects of his temperament that one assumes he would have preferred described more generously. When I describe something in this video as documented, I am pointing at one of those sources. When I say something is alleged or reported without specific attribution, that distinction is intentional. If you found this channel for the first time through this video, and you haven't subscribed yet, right now is a reasonable moment to do it. This channel covers these stories at a level of detail that a 40-minute documentary cannot reach, and the runtime here is not filler. Hit the button below and the notification bell. Then let's go back to where this story actually starts, which is not Monaco and not a film festival. Grace Patricia Kelly was born on November 12, 1929, in East Falls, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the third of 4 children in a family whose public face was athletic achievement and whose private atmosphere was, by multiple accounts, emotionally complicated in the particular way that households built around a demanding, achievement-oriented father and a carefully self-controlled mother tend to be. Her father, John Brendan Kelly Sr., known to everyone as Jack, had built his construction and brickwork fortune through a combination of physical discipline and competitive ferocity that found its clearest expression in rowing. He won 3 Olympic gold medals, 1 at the 1920 Games in Antwerp and 2 at the 1924 Games in Paris. He held the Diamond Sculls record at Henley. He ran his household on the settled understanding that achievement was the baseline, not the goal. Her mother, Margaret Major Kelly, was herself an accomplished athlete, a model and physical education teacher who had been the first woman to coach men's swimming at the University of Pennsylvania. She had grown up the daughter of German immigrants, and she brought to the household a discipline of manner and presentation that complemented Jack's competitive intensity without softening it appreciably. The 4 Kelly children, Peggy, John Jr., Grace, and Lizanne, grew up inside a set of expectations that would be legible to anyone who has been raised in a high-achieving American family of that era and background. Excellence was assumed. Effort was non-negotiable. The expression of self-doubt was a form of weakness the household did not have space for. Jack Kelly's specific opinion of acting as a profession was that it was not one. His older brother George, Grace's Uncle George, had become a playwright and had won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama in 1926 for a play called Craig's Wife, a piece about marital control and domestic suffocation that has an irony to it, given the rest of this story. Jack had watched George succeed in the theater and formed from the observation, not admiration, but a fixed conclusion. The entertainment world was where people went when they lacked the discipline for something real. This view did not adjust as evidence accumulated against it. When Grace moved to New York at 18 to attend the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, he thought she would eventually find her way back to something serious. When she started landing modeling work and theater roles, he waited for her to come to her senses. When she shot Mogambo opposite Clark Gable in Africa at 23, and the reviews were overwhelming, he found other things to discuss. When the Academy Award arrived in 1955, he accepted it as a fact, without revising his assessment of the industry that produced it. This matters as biography in the specific sense that it establishes what Grace Kelly heard from the most authoritative male figure in her life from her earliest years, that her most serious ambition was not worth serious respect. She heard this while building a professional career of considerable achievement. She heard it at the height of the acclaim for The Country Girl. She is reported to have heard some version of it while she was engaged to a prince. That pattern of accomplished older men who simultaneously admired her and could not fully approve of her, who gave her their attention and then took it back in some essential way, predates Monaco. It runs through her Hollywood relationships, shows up clearly in the specific men she was drawn to, and does not stop when she moves into a palace. The palace gives it a different setting and considerably higher institutional stakes. She arrived at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York in 1947, at 18, and moved into an apartment on East 63rd Street. She paid for her tuition through modeling work, which she was physically suited for and quickly successful at, appearing in television advertisements and editorial spreads for publications including Redbook. She graduated from the Academy in 1949, did theater work, and began landing small roles in the early television drama that was expanding rapidly in New York in the early 1950s, appearing in live dramatic productions that went out to the growing American television audience and that provided the practical training that drama school had started. By the time she got to Hollywood, she had done more live performance work than most of her contemporaries. Her first significant Hollywood film was High Noon in 1952, opposite Gary Cooper. She was 22. Cooper was 51. The production attracted attention, and some of that attention was about the chemistry between the lead actors that read differently on screen than professional civility strictly required, a subject that biographers have handled with varying levels of directness. Grace played Amy Fowler, the Quaker bride who would eventually choose her husband over her pacifist convictions, and the performance was noticed even as the film's attention centered on Cooper. Hitchcock saw it and took note. The Africa production for Mugambo in 1953 was a different kind of experience. John Ford brought Grace, Clark Gable, and Ava Gardner to locations in Uganda and the Belgian Congo for a safari-themed romantic drama that required everyone to function in conditions that stripped away a great deal of the usual Hollywood social structure. Grace was 23, Gable was 52. What developed between them on location has been addressed by biographers with varying levels of specificity, and the consistent element across different accounts is that the attraction was mutual, and that Gable, who was by then an established Hollywood institution and a genuinely difficult person, found Grace unlike the women he had typically worked with. He later said, in terms careful enough to be quotable, that she was the most fascinating woman he had ever known. The film was a success. It brought Grace her first Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress. She did not win that year. Then came Hitchcock. Dial M for Murder was shot in early 1954, a thriller in which Grace played a woman whose husband hires a man to kill her, and she survives. Then Rear Window, shot the same year, in which she played Lisa Fremont, a fashion model who gets pulled into her boyfriend's obsession with a possible murder across the courtyard. Both films were critical and commercial successes, and both revealed something about what Grace Kelly could do in front of a camera that the studio system of the era was not designed to accommodate. She had access to a register of intelligence and contained emotion that Hitchcock understood how to use, and that other directors of the period were less sure what to do with. In Rear Window, there is a scene where her character finally takes a direct physical risk and breaks into an apartment across the courtyard. The look she gives Jimmy Stewart's character when she realizes he's watching from across the way while she holds up a piece of evidence. It is one of the more complex single expressions in American film of that decade. Hitchcock knew what he had. He called her again. To Catch a Thief was shot in the summer of 1954 on the French Riviera, near Cannes and Monaco. Cary Grant played the lead. Grace played an American heiress. The film was lighter than the previous two Hitchcock collaborations, warmer and more comic in its texture, and it gave Grace Kelly the opportunity to demonstrate that she could carry a romantic comedy opposite one of the most technically accomplished screen actors of the era, and not disappear. She did not disappear. She and Grant became genuine friends during the production, a friendship that lasted until her death, and that both of them described in subsequent interviews with a warmth that was clearly not performed for the press. Grant would be at the wedding. He would be, in the years that followed, one of the people she called when the palace became too much. The country girl was the role that won the Oscar, and it was also the most challenging thing she had been asked to do to that point. The film was an adaptation of Clifford Odets's play about a theater director, played by Bing Crosby, who is sinking into alcoholism, and his wife, played by Grace, who has built her entire existence around managing his decline while concealing it from the world. George Seaton directed. The role required Grace to play someone unglamorous, exhausted, running on low-grade anxiety for the entire runtime, and the studio's publicity operation had significant reservations about asking their most photographed asset to appear on screen in a frumpy housecoat with her hair undone and dark circles under her eyes. She did it anyway. She won the Oscar on March 30th, 1955, beating Judy Garland's performance in A Star is Born, a result that surprised enough people in the industry that the debate about it continued in print for years afterward. She was 25. The Oscar was on her mantelpiece. Her relationship with Oleg Cassini had recently collapsed. Cassini had been the most serious of Grace's pre-Monaco relationships, the one that had gotten farthest in the direction of a conventional future. He was a fashion designer, considerably older than she was, charming in the specific way that very handsome men who are also talented and professionally successful can be charming when they choose to apply it. He proposed marriage. Jack Kelly refused his approval on the grounds that Cassini was divorced, which in the framework of Catholic doctrine Jack adhered to, made the marriage impossible in any form Grace could present to her family without a rupture, and a rupture with Jack Kelly was not something Grace was yet willing to cause. She and Cassini ended the relationship. She continued in an apartment in Manhattan with photographers outside the building and a studio contract that owned her public image, and a professional life that had no quiet corners in it. By the spring of 1955, Donald Spoto documents in High Society, the pace had taken something from her that she had difficulty naming. She was not clinically unwell. She was not ready to stop, but she was working inside a system that was extracting everything it could from her as a commodity and providing nothing back that corresponded to what she actually needed from her professional life, which was the chance to do the kind of work she had just done in The Country Girl, but on terms she had some agency in setting. The MGM contract did not work that way. The MGM contract worked the way studio contracts of that era worked: total, extractive, and designed to benefit the institution rather than the individual it was extracting from. In May of 1955, the French magazine Paris Match asked her to pose for a photograph with the reigning Prince of Monaco during the Cannes Film Festival. Grace agreed. It would fill an afternoon she had available before a dinner engagement. She borrowed a floral dress because her own clothing was at the laundry. She arrived at the Palais des Festivals on May 6, 1955, and met Prince Rainier III for the first time. The Monaco that Grace Kelly was being brought to meet in May 1955 bore almost no relationship to the Monaco that exists in current imagination, the Monaco of the Formula One Grand Prix, and the superyacht marina, and the most expensive real estate per square meter on Earth. The Monaco of 1955 was a principality in genuine financial difficulty, running on the fumes of a pre-war glamour that had not survived the post-war world intact. The territory itself is extraordinary in its compactness. At approximately 2.1 square kilometers, it is smaller than Central Park in Manhattan. It is surrounded on 3 sides by France and on the 4th by the Mediterranean. Its population in the mid-1950s was approximately 22,000. Its economy ran almost entirely on the Société des Bains de Mer, the SBM, a company that owned the casino, most of the major hotels, the opera house, the golf club, the primary beach clubs, and most of the commercial property of any size in the principality. If the SBM had revenue problems, Monaco had revenue problems, and in 1955, the SBM had revenue problems. The international gambling market had changed since the 1920s and 1930s, when the Monte Carlo casino had been the preeminent gambling destination in Europe and possibly the world. American GIs who had flooded the Riviera immediately after the Second World War had returned home. Cheaper casinos had opened along the French and Italian coasts. The European super-rich who had once filled the tables had either aged out of the casino circuit or redirected their spending to newer venues. The SBM's quarterly reports told the same story in each successive quarter, and the man reading those reports with the most acute concern was not Rainier. Aristotle Socrates Onassis had acquired roughly a third of the SBM's shares in the early 1950s through a financial maneuver that caught Rainier off guard, and that the prince, by every account of his feelings on the matter, found somewhere between irritating and infuriating. Onassis had continued accumulating SBM shares after the initial purchase. By 1955, he held enough to have significant influence over the company's direction, and he was exercising that influence with the aggressive commercial confidence of a man who had built one of the world's largest shipping fortunes from nothing. Onassis was not interested in Monaco as a cultural institution or a historical curiosity. He was interested in it as an investment, and his investment was underperforming. He had his analysis of the problem. The American tourist market, the only market large enough to reverse the SBM's revenue trajectory in any meaningful time frame, was not coming to Monaco in sufficient numbers because Monaco had nothing that gave American tourists a reason to put it at the top of their European itinerary over destinations that had more obvious marketing hooks. A casino that Europeans thought of as glamorous did not automatically translate into American tourist traffic. What Onassis understood, from his long experience with American capital and American media, was that the American market ran on faces. If a face sufficiently recognizable to the American public was associated with Monaco, the American market would respond. The face needed to be American. It needed to be Catholic to satisfy Rainier's requirements, and it needed to be recognizable enough across enough American magazine covers that the association would stick. Rainier had a private chaplain and spiritual advisor named Father Francis Tucker, an American Dominican priest who had served in that capacity for some years and who had developed, in parallel with his religious duties, something that looked in practical terms like a matchmaking brief. Tucker had arrived at much the same analysis as Onassis from a different direction. The prince needed an American Catholic woman of some public profile, and the right candidate had not yet materialized through the usual channels of European aristocratic social circulation. He had been corresponding with people in American Catholic social networks for months, looking for the candidate, and he had been in communication with Onassis about the shared requirement. The Paris match correspondent who arranged the Cannes meeting later went on record in accounts cited by Robert Lacey that the afternoon of May 6, 1955, did not come together through coincidence or the casual intersection of two busy schedules. It was placed. The photographer, the setting, the specific participants, all of it had been arranged in advance by people with specific practical reasons for wanting this photograph to exist. Grace Kelly had not been given full information about what she was walking into that afternoon. She had agreed to fill an hour for a magazine shoot with a minor European head of state. She arrived in a borrowed dress. She found Rainier courteous and, by her later account to friends, unexpectedly shy, which she had not anticipated from someone in his position. She found the afternoon pleasant. She had a dinner engagement afterward, and she went to it. The photograph that resulted ran in Paris Match, and then in Life magazine, and in papers across Europe and the United States. It was, as a piece of visual content, exactly what Onassis and Tucker and the Paris Match correspondent had needed it to be. An image of a specific kind of beauty, specifically American, specifically composed, attached to a specific tiny principality on the Mediterranean coast. It ran in 40 countries. The SBM communications apparatus clipped every version of it. After Cannes, Grace wrote to Rainier. He wrote back. The correspondence ran through the summer and fall of 1955, formal in its opening structure, and gradually warmer, according to biographers who later had access to portions of it. Rainier's letters, in particular, had a personal directness that surprised people who knew him primarily through his public manner, which was careful and reserved to the point of opacity. He had, apparently, a voice in writing that corresponded poorly to the public figure he presented. He used it. She responded at length. This went on for several months. In October, Grace accepted an invitation to visit Monaco for 4 days in December. She brought her parents, which communicated to everyone involved exactly how seriously the visit was understood. She toured the palace. She visited the zoo that Rainier kept on the palace grounds, a collection of animals that reflected his genuine interest in natural history, including tigers, elephants, and a variety of exotic species that the prince maintained and personally supervised with more enthusiasm than his official duties required. She met members of the household. She navigated the social atmosphere of the Grimaldi court with the same composed attention she had brought to navigating every professional situation since she was 18. She also underwent, at some point during or around that visit, a medical examination administered by palace physicians. Donald Spoto addresses this in High Society. Robert Lacey's biography notes it. Geoffrey Robinson's work discusses it. The examination was the same examination that the palace had administered to Gisèle Pascal in the years before. The reason for it was the Franco-Monegasque Treaty of 1918, which had established, in terms that left no interpretive room, that if the reigning Prince of Monaco died without producing a legitimate Grimaldi heir, the principality would revert to French sovereignty. No heir meant no Monaco. The clause had been written into the treaty by France at the end of the First World War as an explicit assertion of its ultimate authority over the territory, and in 1955 the clause remained operative and legally binding. Given that Rainier had no children and had been on the throne for 6 years with no heir apparent and no obvious candidate to produce one with, the treaty provision was not a historical footnote, it was a live threat. The palace had run the examination with Gisèle Pascal and had terminated the relationship with her based on its results. Grace Kelly was presented with the same requirement. She passed the examination. The palace moved forward. That fact deserves to sit plainly for a moment before we continue. A 26-year-old woman with an Academy Award, a recently ended serious relationship, a studio contract that had been grinding her down for 5 years, and a father who had never taken her most important work seriously, agreed, before a formal proposal had been made to her, to a medical examination administered by the household of the man she was being assessed as a potential spouse for. She passed it. The engagement discussions accelerated. The announcement followed 6 weeks after the December visit. On January 5, 1956, Grace Kelly announced her engagement to Prince Rainier III of Monaco. She had known him for 8 months. She had spent approximately 10 days in his physical company, across 2 meetings. She had agreed, on the basis of that acquaintance, to leave the United States, surrender her professional identity, give up her citizenship, move to a country where she spoke the language with effort, take up a position whose actual demands had not been fully explained to her, and produce the children that a treaty required her to produce. She had also agreed to a financial transaction. The dowry was $2 million in 1956 currency, a figure that converts to approximately $23 million in current terms. Her film earnings covered half of it. Her father covered the remainder, and by every account of his disposition on the matter, he was not quiet about it. He thought the arrangement was humiliating. He paid it anyway. He continued to think it was humiliating. A quote is attributed to Jack Kelly in this connection, some version of the statement that his daughter did not need to pay any man to marry her, and the line circulates in every Grace Kelly biography and documentary in various formulations. The exact wording is uncertain enough across different sources that it should not be reproduced as verbatim. What the primary record clearly supports is that Jack Kelly resisted the dowry requirement, communicated his resistance in letters to his friends and his attorney, and found the entire arrangement a source of lasting resentment. The polished one-liner version of his objection is probably a tidied summary of something rougher. The shape of the feeling is accurately represented. Grace spent the months between the January announcement and the April wedding completing the 2 films she had contractually owed MGM. The Swan, shot with Alec Guinness and Louis Jourdan, was a period romantic comedy about a princess being presented to a crown prince, which, given the circumstances of its production, had a particular texture for everyone on set who was aware of what was actually happening in Grace Kelly's life. High Society, the musical remake of the Philadelphia Story with Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra, was her final American film, shot at MGM's Culver City studios. She was on screens playing a socialite, navigating romantic complications, while simultaneously being measured for a wedding dress that would be seen by 30 million people. Both films have a retrospective character that is hard to see past. They are the last thing she made before the door closed, and neither the studio nor Grace herself framed them that way at the time. She thought she was pausing. She would resume. She said this to friends. She believed it. The wedding took place over 2 days, April 18 and 19, 1956. The civil ceremony first at the Palais de Monaco, and the religious ceremony the following morning at the Cathedral of Our Lady Immaculate. The number of television viewers for the religious ceremony has been estimated in different accounts at between 30 and 45 million. Whatever the precise figure, it was one of the most watched television events in history to that point, exceeding the television audiences for the coronation of Elizabeth II in 1953 in certain international markets. MGM assigned cameras and treated the event as a marketing asset. The studio understood that the marriage of their Oscar-winning actress to a genuine European sovereign was a piece of content that would pay returns for years, regardless of what the marriage itself produced. Grace's dress was designed by Helen Rose, MGM's chief costume designer, and built from 25 yards of silk taffeta, antique rose point Brussels lace older than the United States, and pearl beading across a fitted bodice and a high collar that became one of the most reproduced wedding dress designs of the 20th century. Rose and a team of MGM seamstresses worked on the dress for 6 weeks. Grace wore white gloves and carried white orchids. She arrived at the cathedral in a closed car and walked the length of the aisle with her father, who had spent months writing pointed letters about the indignity of paying for the privilege of delivering her there. Among the guests, Cary Grant, who had been her co-star in To Catch a Thief, and had become one of her closest friends. Frank Sinatra, who had worked with her on High Society, and who sat at the reception with the easy informality of a man who had spent his career treating formal occasions as optional. The guest list of 600 required the principality to operate at a level of ceremonial complexity that its small administrative structure found genuinely challenging, and it worked through the challenge because the alternative was visible failure in front of 30 million television viewers. After the ceremony, Grace and Rainier embarked on a Mediterranean honeymoon cruise aboard Rainier's yacht, the Deo Giovante II. The yacht was a reasonable size for a private vessel, not ostentatious by the standards of the international super-rich who circulated through Monte Carlo, and the honeymoon cruise took the couple along the Mediterranean coast through the spring weather of the region. They were extensively photographed at ports. They were at least as extensively observed as any private couple on a yacht trying to have a honeymoon while the world's press tracked their location could be expected to be, which is to say, not particularly privately. When they returned to Monaco and Grace moved into the Palais de Monaco, the practical dimensions of what she had agreed to became concrete in ways that the engagement period and the wedding celebration had deferred. The palace building itself was not, at that point, an especially comfortable domestic environment. It was a working government building that also happened to be the residence of the ruling prince, and it had been organized around governmental function rather than domestic warmth. The rooms available to Grace were formal, cold in both temperature and atmosphere, in the ways that very old, very thick-walled European palace buildings tend to be, and decorated in styles that reflected the preferences of previous Grimaldi generations rather than anyone currently living in them. Grace, who had a genuine interest in interior design and who had spent her adult life creating apartments that felt like places to actually inhabit rather than spaces to perform in, found the palace a project. She worked on it over the following years with a seriousness that people who observed the results consistently noted. The rooms she redesigned and refurnished felt different from the rooms she had found. She brought American proportions to European spaces, warm colors against the stone, furniture that could be sat in rather than posed beside. But the physical space was the easier problem. The Monegasque aristocratic circle that constituted the social world Grace had moved into was small, historically self-referential, and protective of its codes, in the way that small, historically anxious institutions tend to be. It was also, as such circles tend to be, very quick to locate and assess the outsider. Grace was assessed immediately as a Hollywood actress, which in the social taxonomy of Monaco in 1956 sat in a category that was neither princess nor tourist, but which carried elements of both characterizations. She was not rejected. She was maintained at the particular social temperature that indicated she was on probation. People were gracious in the formal sense. People were not warm in the personal sense. The distinction was legible to anyone who had spent time in social environments where formality and warmth were administered separately, and Grace had spent years in Hollywood learning to read exactly that distinction. Her French, functional enough for ordinary conversation, but insufficient for the precision and register that court-level social occasions required, was a problem she had not fully anticipated. She understood the language when she heard it at a normal pace. She struggled to produce it with the fluency that the social world expected from a princess. She worked at it consistently over the following years, and her French eventually reached a level of competence that allowed her to carry official functions without visible effort. Getting there took time she could not skip. The palace staff were another layer of the same problem. They were professional, courteous, and completely opaque about their actual assessments. They had served the Grimaldi household for years, and in some cases for decades. Their institutional loyalty ran to the Grimaldi line, which meant to Rainier, and while this was not expressed as hostility toward Grace, it was expressed as a kind of watchful neutrality that communicated, to anyone paying attention, that she was new, and that new things required time before they were trusted. She could not casually telephone a friend in Philadelphia without that call passing through palace channels. She could not take a walk without security. She could not have a conversation with a household staff member that was simply a conversation with a person, because every conversation was also a conversation with Rainier's institutional apparatus. Judith Balaban Quine, in The Bridesmaids, describes letters from Grace in the first years after the wedding that capture this isolation in terms that are very clear about what it felt like. Not a complaint, not quite, because Grace's discipline and her training in composure were too deep for her to write letters that explicitly complained, but an account of a particular kind of alone that she had not anticipated and did not know how to explain to people who had not experienced it. Princess Caroline arrived on January 23, 1957, 9 months and 10 days after the wedding. Princess Grace had done what the Franco-Monegasque Treaty required of her on the most efficient possible schedule. Albert followed in March 1958. The succession was secured. The Grimaldi line would continue. France would not inherit Monaco upon Rainier's death, and then the palace had no plan. The institutional machinery that had identified the need, engineered the marriage, negotiated the terms, and produced 2 heirs in under 2 years, had not extended its planning to the question of what an Oscar-winning actress in her late 20s was supposed to do with the next 4 decades of her existence, once the treaty no longer hung over the principality. This was not a small oversight. It was the structural problem of the entire marriage, and it ran underneath everything else that happened afterward. The palace had built a machine to solve a geopolitical problem. The machine had worked. Nobody had thought about what to do with it once the problem was solved. Rainier Louis-Henri Maxence Bertrand Grimaldi had assumed the throne of Monaco in 1949 at the age of 26, following the death of his grandfather Louis II. He had spent his entire adult life as the absolute authority of a sovereign state that fitted inside 2 square kilometers and had a population smaller than many American university campuses. He had grown into that authority with the completeness that the lack of serious challenge permits, and by the time Grace arrived in 1956, he was 33 years old and had been the most powerful person in every room he had occupied for 7 years. He was also, by accounts of people who knew him in this period, a man of genuine warmth and considerable intellectual curiosity in private, capable of the kind of personal attentiveness that makes someone feel seen in a conversation, and genuinely interested in the natural world, in animals, in ocean conservation, in the mechanisms of things. He kept his private zoo on the palace grounds with personal involvement rather than delegation. He was an accomplished driver, genuinely skilled rather than merely enthusiastic, who had raced in the Monte Carlo rally in the years before his marriage, and who maintained an expert interest in cars and mechanics throughout his life. He had real aesthetic sensibilities and real opinions about music and about architecture, and about the question of what Monaco could become in the second half of the 20th century if it was managed correctly. He was not a figurehead. He was a working head of state who took the work seriously and who had a vision for what he was building. He also had a temper. Geoffrey Robinson's authorized biography, a document that was written with Rainier's cooperation and that Rainier presumably reviewed, describes incidents of explosive anger that palace staff had developed institutional strategies for managing. Not occasional irritability, the friction that comes with running a small state and raising children and managing competing demands. Anger of a different character, arriving without much warning and requiring the household to have thought in advance about how to position themselves when it materialized. Rainier himself, in the interviews Robinson conducted, acknowledges the substance of this description without denying it. He contextualizes it. He does not repudiate it. The specific difficulty of the marriage's structural asymmetry showed itself clearly within the first years after the wedding. Rainier had needed an American face to solve Monaco's American marketing problem, and the American face was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Tourist revenues from American visitors to Monaco began recovering within 2 years of the wedding and continued recovering through the late 1950s. The SBM's quarterly reports told a different story from the ones Onassis had been reading in 1954 and 1955. The strategy had worked precisely as designed. The man who had to live alongside the strategy every day was the husband of the person the strategy centered on, and he was smaller than her in the only measurement that mattered in the international press, which was recognizability. This was not something he had been able to fully anticipate before the wedding. He had understood, abstractly, that Grace Kelly was famous. He had not experienced, in any sustained way, what it meant to stand beside someone whom strangers on the street in Paris addressed with an excitement they did not extend to him. Robert Lacey cites, in his biography, an account of a state visit to Paris in 1959, written by a French journalist who covered it for a domestic newspaper. During a public walkway, the crowd's response had become so completely directed at the princess, and so negligibly directed at the prince standing beside her, that the journalist wrote, in the account Lacey describes, that Rainier looked like a man who had ended up at someone else's event and was managing the situation with whatever dignity he could assemble. The account ran in French newspapers. Rainier read them. He read all of it, and there was in the late 1950s a very great deal of it to read, because Grace Kelly, as a princess, generated more international press coverage than Rainier's principality had in the previous several decades combined. Judith Balaban Quine describes, in The Bridesmaids, a pattern that became consistent in the marriage's first decade. Rainier managed Grace's schedule more tightly than her official responsibilities required. He placed limits, without clear official justification, on how frequently she could travel to the United States. He controlled, through channels that were his channels, her access to communications and her movements outside the palace. None of this was stated as explicit prohibition. It operated instead as the management of logistics, which is the form that control takes in institutional settings when it cannot be expressed openly. Without creating a confrontation, neither party can win cleanly. Grace described this to her American friends in letters that Quine later characterized in The Bridesmaids as careful but clear. She understood what was happening, she understood why it was happening, and she was managing it in the way she managed most things, which was with a composure that concealed the full weight of what she was carrying. The Onassis situation was its own separate thread running through the early years of the marriage. Rainier had been furious about Onassis's SBM acquisition from the moment it happened, and the presence of the Greek shipping magnate as a major stakeholder in Monaco's economy was a source of ongoing friction between them. In the years following the wedding, as the Monaco tourist revenues recovered and the SBM returned to profitability, Rainier began the slow and expensive project of buying back enough SBM shares to remove Onassis from significant influence over the company. The process took most of the 1960s. By 1967, Rainier had succeeded in restructuring the SBM shareholding in a way that ended Onassis's effective control. The man who had helped engineer the marriage that made Monaco financially viable enough to fund the buyback was eventually removed from the institution his strategy had helped save. Onassis moved his attention, and in 1968 married Jacqueline Kennedy, which provided the newspapers with the particular satisfaction of watching the man who had identified the American face strategy deploy it again on his own behalf. Whether he saw the symmetry is not documented. The tabloid biographical tradition around this marriage has settled, in the years since Grace's death, on a narrative about Rainier as a habitual philanderer who made his wife's life a sustained misery for 26 years. The narrative is durable. It is not supported by the primary documentary record. Robert Lacey addresses this specifically. His conclusion, after working with the archival material available to him, is that no documented primary source evidence exists for chronic infidelity by Rainier during the marriage. Not in the palace records, not in the correspondence, not in the testimony of people with direct and sustained access to both of them. Judith Balaban Quine, who had every reason to know and no institutional reason to protect Rainier's reputation, does not support the philanderer account in The Bridesmaids. Geoffrey Robinson, who worked directly with Rainier over an extended period, does not support it. Geoffrey Robinson's authorized biography, which has access to the household's institutional memory and which Rainier cooperated with, contains frank descriptions of his temper and his controlling tendencies. It does not contain infidelity. What the tabloid biographies offer in place of documentation is anonymous sourcing of the kind that serious historians treat as a warning label rather than evidence. Wendy Lee's biography, which contains the most elaborate version of the suffering princess narrative, has been examined by researchers working with the primary material and found to rest, in its most dramatic claims, on sources that are either unidentified, unverifiable, or directly contradicted by the documented record. The narrative's commercial durability is testimony to what audiences want this story to be. It is not testimony to what the archives show. The honest picture of Rainier as a husband is neither the fairy tale version nor the tabloid version. He was authoritarian at home in ways the authorized sources confirm. He exercised control over Grace's professional and social movements in ways that the primary correspondence documents. He was resentful of the fame asymmetry in ways that expressed themselves as practical restrictions on her life. He could be cold in ways that people who observed the household noticed and remembered. He could also be warm, genuinely and without performance, in ways that the same people noticed. He was a man who had been raised to treat absolute authority as the natural condition of his existence, who then married a woman the world was more interested in than him, and who never found a way to carry that specific weight without some of it landing on her. That failure had real consequences. The consequences are documented. They are not the same as the tabloid version of them, and they are not nothing. The year 1962 is where the marriage showed its real structure most clearly, through a film that Grace never made. Alfred Hitchcock had been in pre-production since the early 1960s on an adaptation of Winston Graham's novel about a woman who compulsively steals from her employers, whose behavior traces to a childhood trauma she has suppressed. He called it Marnie. He had directed Grace in 3 films over an 8-year period: Dial M for Murder, Rear Window, and To Catch a Thief. He had formed, over the course of those 3 collaborations, a specific theory about what Grace Kelly could do that he had not yet found the right material to reach. The roles she had played with him had been good, some of them very good, but they had operated within constraints he thought were limiting access to something he could see just underneath the surface of every one of her performances. A quality of damage held in check by a quality of will, and a camera that understood the relationship between the two and found it compelling in a way that Hitchcock understood as the essential thing. Marnie, he believed, was the role that would finally reach it. The character was complicated in ways that the studio system of the 1950s would not have permitted him to pursue with Grace when they were actually working together. She had not been under that system since 1956. She was available to him in a way she had not been before. He called the palace. Grace and Rainier discussed it. Grace was interested in a way that went beyond the professional interest of an actress presented with a good part. She was interested in the way that someone is interested in a thing they have been waiting for, without knowing exactly what it was they were waiting for. The roles she had done in Hollywood had been very good in their best iterations, genuinely demanding in some cases, but they had been shaped by what the studio era permitted, a specific version of female intelligence and female vulnerability that stayed within the frame of conventional attractiveness and conventional sympathy. Marnie did not stay within that frame. It required inhabiting a psychological interior that was genuinely unpleasant, a character whose behavior was not likable and whose history was not comforting, with the full commitment that Hitchcock's method required. She had the training. She had, by 1962, also 6 years of distance from the studio system and its limitations. She wanted to do it. In March 1962, the Palais de Monaco formally announced that Princess Grace would return to films in Hitchcock's production. The announcement ran in papers across Europe and the United States. The American press treated it as exactly what it was from their perspective: the return of a major star after a 6-year absence, the end of a hiatus that the press had been waiting for since the wedding. The European coverage was more interested in the political and cultural dimensions of a European sovereign flying to Hollywood to make movies, which was not a thing that happened, and which generated its own texture of editorial comment. What happened in Monaco, when the announcement appeared, was something the palace communications operation had not prepared for. The Monegasque public reacted with open hostility. Their princess intended to fly to America to play a thief. She would spend months on a Hollywood film set. She would be directed by a man who was publicly known, from his own statements and from accounts of his previous productions, for his particular manner with his female leads. She would appear on camera, in intimate scenes, opposite Sean Connery, in a role that required her to be kissed by someone who was not her husband, while the cameras rolled, and while her country faced ongoing economic pressure from the most powerful nation in Europe. Letters arrived at the palace, expressing outrage. Clergy across the principality made their views known through whatever channels clergy have available. The local press amplified the dissatisfaction. The geopolitical pressure arrived simultaneously, and was considerably more dangerous than the public relations problem. Charles de Gaulle had decided, in the early 1960s, that Monaco's status as a tax haven, operating inside what was functionally French geography, had become an intolerable drain on French state revenues. French citizens and corporations had been routing income through Monaco to avoid French income tax for decades, and by the early 1960s the scale of that avoidance had grown from a manageable irritant to a fiscal wound that de Gaulle, who was not a man who managed things through patience when he could manage them through force, was no longer willing to tolerate. He demanded that Monaco align its income tax structure with France's. Rainier refused. The confrontation escalated through the spring and summer of 1962, and in October, de Gaulle announced that France would establish customs barriers around Monaco, effectively a blockade of a principality that required French roads, French utilities, and French supply chains to function. Grace's announcement of her withdrawal from Marne came in June 1962, several months before de Gaulle's blockade announcement, a timing detail that the narrative of the de Gaulle crisis as the cause of the withdrawal tends to obscure. The public statement cited the concerns of the Monegasque public and the delicacy of the diplomatic situation between Monaco and France. It was accurate as far as it went. Donald Spoto's research in high society establishes that it did not go far enough. Rainier's opposition to the Marne project predated the de Gaulle announcement by several months, and it did not rest primarily on the geopolitical situation. He had concerns about the role itself, about what it required Grace to do on screen, about Hitchcock's reputation for his manner with the women he directed, about what a production that would keep his wife in Hollywood for months would mean for the orientation of the household. The de Gaulle crisis provided the political cover for a veto he had already decided to exercise. He took the cover. He had learned, in 6 years of managing Monaco's relationship with France, how to use the available cover when it was offered. The role went to Tippi Hedren. What followed between Hedren and Hitchcock during the production of Marne is a documented history considerably darker than anything in Grace Kelly's professional experience with the director, and it falls outside this video's scope. What matters for this story is that Grace Kelly withdrew in June 1962 and never appeared in another film. Ever. The Marne withdrawal ended her screen career, without either party to the decision explicitly framing it as an ending, because framing it as permanent would have required both of them to acknowledge what neither was ready to acknowledge, that there was no version of Grace Kelly's professional ambitions that was compatible with Rainier's household, and that this had been true since April 1956 and was not going to change. What followed in the months after the withdrawal is documented in the correspondence that Quine describes in The Bridesmaids. Grace fell into a depression. Not publicly. The public face of Princess Grace in the months after the withdrawal was the same precisely calibrated, formally appropriate figure the palace had been presenting for 6 years. What the private letters to her American friends showed was a woman carrying a weight she could not name, in a way that allowed others to help with it. She had told herself when she married that the sacrifice of her career was temporary. She had told her friends this. She had believed it. The Marne situation clarified that it was not temporary and had never been going to be temporary, and the clarity had come not through anything she had decided or failed to do, but through the combination of her husband's private veto and Charles de Gaulle's opinions about tax policy. She was 32, she had an Oscar, she had a life that looked, from the outside, like everything a woman of her generation could aspire to. And she had just watched the last professional exit close, permanently, because a diplomatic crisis between 2 neighboring governments had handed her husband the political cover he needed for the veto he had already decided to execute. That is a particular kind of loss. It is also a particular kind of marriage that produces that outcome at that moment. The version of Grace Kelly's post-Marne life that circulates most widely in popular culture has her in a state of elegant decline through the 1960s and 1970s. A brilliant woman, reduced to presiding over galas and smiling for state photographs, while the ambition that had carried her from East Falls to Manhattan, to Hollywood, to an Oscar, quietly evacuated. This account appears in its most fully developed form in Wendy Lee's biography of Grace Kelly, and has been reproduced in a number of subsequent documentaries and popular accounts. It has also been fairly comprehensively rejected by historians who worked with the primary material, because the primary record does not support it. Grace had been president of the Monegasque Red Cross since 1958. When she assumed the role, it was a ceremonial appointment, name on letterhead, appearance at the annual gala, the kind of royal patronage that European institutions had been using since the 19th century to give their charitable organizations a face without giving them a working executive. The Red Cross of Monaco operated on a budget and with a staff that reflected this status, thin in proportion to the letterhead, functional at the ceremonial level, not much else. By the time of Grace's death in 1982, the organization looked substantively different. The budget had grown. The staff had grown. The international programs had expanded to a degree that previous administrations had not approached. People who worked within the organization during the period of Grace's presidency consistently describe her involvement as executive rather than ceremonial. She attended the administrative meetings. She asked questions about program outcomes that required people to have prepared answers. She reviewed budgets with enough understanding to ask useful follow-up questions. She treated the organization as an operational institution, not a patronage arrangement, and the difference showed in the results. The Red Cross of Monaco that functions in the 21st century, doing operational charitable work internationally, traces its institutional capacity in direct line to the development Grace Kelly drove between 1958 and 1982. In 1963, she founded AMAD, the World Association of Children's Friends. The organization's stated mission centered on the protection and welfare of children internationally. It began, as most international NGOs begin, small, an organizing committee, a founding document, a limited initial program scope. By the time of Grace's death, AMAD had active operations in dozens of countries and held consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council, a designation that requires demonstrating sustained organizational capacity and program delivery. It continues to function today, in the 21st century, as an operational international NGO with UN consultative status. The organization that holds that status in 2024 is the direct institutional descendant of what Grace Kelly built from nothing in 1963, during the decade when the decline narrative requires her to have been collapsing into elegant uselessness. She took on the cultural development of Monaco in ways the Principality had not previously attempted. The Monte Carlo Ballet developed its contemporary institutional footing under her patronage. She established a foundation that distributed grants to emerging artists and performers, with a program stream specifically directed at American students seeking European arts training, which served simultaneously as arts infrastructure for Monaco and as a continuing personal bridge between the Principality and the country she had left. The Monte Carlo cultural season acquired, under her management over 20 years, a character and a level of seriousness it had not had when she arrived. Cultural figures of genuine standing came to Monaco for events that Grace had organized, and the Principality's reputation as a place where serious artistic work happened was, in part, a reputation she had built. Around 1976, she began giving public poetry readings in collaboration with John Westbrook, a British actor whose formal training and whose specific quality of voice put him at the top of the BBC radio dramatic world. They developed programs of English poetry and prose, rehearsed them with professional care, and performed them at venues that treated the readings as events rather than royal appearances: the Edinburgh Festival, concert halls in England, performance spaces in the United States during Grace's visits. Critics who reviewed the readings at the Edinburgh Festival, critics who had no obligation to be generous about them and who were not in the habit of adjusting their standards for titled performers, wrote about them in the same terms they would have applied to any professional literary performance. The voice Grace Kelly had trained from her early years in New York had not lost its instrument. She was deploying it in the only configuration the palace would accept, which excluded film and theatre and anything that could be characterized as professional competition with Rainier's role, but which left open a form that was genuinely artistic and was received as such. She also produced a substantial body of pressed flower botanical art. She assembled the work carefully, exhibited it at galleries in Paris, New York, and Tokyo, and received from critics who encountered it, without knowing who had made it, the kind of response that any botanical illustrator of similar technical competence would receive: specific and honest engagement with the work on its own terms, without the framing of "Princess does something charming at a gala." The pieces were formally considered. They were stylistically coherent. They represented sustained creative work in a discipline that requires patience and a specific kind of attention that Grace had in abundance. This is not the output of a woman who has given up on having an artistic life. It is the output of someone who has found the narrowest possible opening within a severe set of constraints and is using it with full professional commitment. Her Paris apartment, which she renovated in the late 1970s on the Avenue Foch in the 8th arrondissement, near the addresses where she had stayed during earlier Parisian visits in the 1950s, has been misread by the tabloid tradition in a way persistent enough to require direct correction. The standard tabloid interpretation treats the Paris apartment as evidence of a separation in progress, a prelude to a divorce, the construction of an exit from a marriage Grace could no longer tolerate. Every serious biographer who has examined the marital correspondence pushes back against this interpretation. Grace Kelly was a practicing Catholic with 3 children, whose institutional futures were tied to a European throne. She had spent 20 years building a public identity in Monaco that she had found ways to make meaningful. She was not constructing an exit. She was constructing a workspace, the only kind available to her within the constraints the palace imposed, a private room in a city she had always loved, for the artistic and organizational work that the palace could not characterize as threatening without looking absurd. The Paris apartment was where the poetry reading programs were developed. It was where the flower art was produced. It was where she could have conversations with people in the arts world without those conversations passing through palace channels first. It was, in the plainest description, a room of her own, and she used it as working people use the spaces they have made specifically for work. In the last 2 years of her life, Grace was running more simultaneous activities than at any point since the early 1960s. The Red Cross required daily administrative attention. Armade demanded international travel and organizational oversight. The poetry reading programs needed preparation, rehearsal, and travel. The flower art was in active production, with gallery deadlines to meet. Stephanie required what amounted to daily management through phone calls and in-person conversations. Caroline was rebuilding from the Junot marriage and its collapse. Albert was managing the pressures of being the heir to a man whose communicative style had not softened with age. Rainier was dealing with Monaco's ongoing relationship with France, the state finances, and the accumulated complexity of running a small sovereign state in late 20th century Europe. Grace Kelly, in the fall of 1982, was not declining. She was fully engaged in more things simultaneously than most 52-year-olds in any profession manage, and she was doing it inside a life that had not become less constrained than it had been when she arrived at 26. The constraint had simply become the condition she worked within, rather than the thing she was still adjusting to. The children require their own section because they are among the clearest lenses through which the household's dynamics between Grace and Rainier are visible, and because the biographical literature tends to treat them as color rather than as subjects with their own complexity. Caroline Louise Marguerite was born January 23, 1957. She grew up in a palace with 2 parents whose ideas about what a parent was supposed to do and what a household was supposed to feel like were not simply different, but were organized around principles that operated in direct opposition to each other. Rainier parented from the old European monarchical tradition. Authority communicated through volume and through the weight of his personal presence in a room. Expectations enforced through the expression of disappointment when they were not met. Discipline as the primary grammar of instruction. He ran the family as he ran the principality, as an absolute authority whose decisions were not subject to negotiation. The staff of the palace had developed institutional strategies for managing the prince's moods. The children developed their own. Grace ran the opposite playbook. She sat on the floor with her children. She let them be loud in ways the palace did not conventionally accommodate. She read to them in English, in a palace where the official language was French, and where Rainier preferred French at the dinner table, and they answered her in English, creating a private domestic language that operated outside the formal grammar of the household. She brought to motherhood the warmth that had been conspicuously absent from the household she had grown up in, the warmth that Jack Kelly's competitive standards had not permitted, and she applied it with a generosity that Monegasque palace conventions found excessive. The closeness she maintained with her daughters was, by European aristocratic standards, inappropriate for a princess. By any American standard, it was unremarkable. Albert Alexandre Louis Pierre, the heir, was born March 14, 1958. He developed a stutter as a child, a fact that appears in the biographies of this family, with enough consistency and enough contextual specificity to carry weight, and the accounts of people with knowledge of the household during Albert's childhood connect the stutter, consistently and explicitly, to the particular pressure of being Rainier's son, of growing up as the person through whom the throne would pass, in a household where the person who currently occupied that throne communicated his expectations through a form of personal presence that filled rooms. Albert worked through the stutter over years, with speech therapy and with the kind of sustained effort that visible problems require when the person who has them is also expected to appear in public regularly and to represent an institution. He eventually overcame it. For a significant period of his childhood and adolescence, it was pronounced, and inside the household, the people who noticed it understood what they were looking at. Grace and Albert developed, in his later childhood and his teenage years, a relationship that multiple accounts describe as genuinely close, in a way that her relationship with Rainier was not, by the later years of the marriage, genuinely close. He was the person in the palace who most resembled what she had hoped the household could be, which was warm and honest, and not entirely governed by protocol. He attended Amherst College in Massachusetts as an undergraduate, which gave him several years of American experience that his mother had specifically encouraged, and which produced in him, by the accounts of people who knew him at both Amherst and in Monaco, a combination of European formality and American ease that was not common in his family's social world. Stephanie, born February 1, 1965, the youngest of the three, spent her teenage years declining to perform any of the roles her circumstances required her to perform, with a consistency that was, depending on how you looked at it, either deeply problematic or the most honest thing in the palace. She wanted to model. She wanted to record music. She wanted to drive racing cars, an interest she had developed seriously and which was not, by the standards of the Grimaldi family, particularly unusual, given that Rainier himself had raced in the Monte Carlo rally, but which attached in Stephanie's case to a larger pattern of refusing to be directed by palace requirements. She communicated these preferences openly. Grace's management of Stephanie's teenage years took what amounted to daily operational attention, phone calls about what was and was not possible within the framework the family's public position imposed, conversations about what specific decisions would mean for the people they would affect, ongoing negotiation with a 17-year-old who had decided, not unreasonably, that the terms of the negotiation were themselves the problem. Caroline's marriage to Philippe Junot in June 1978 was the episode that tested Grace's composure most publicly in the decade before the crash. Junot was 38 years old, Caroline was 21. His social reputation in Paris was the kind that reads clearly to anyone who has spent time in those social circles. A charming, handsome man of ambiguous professional substance, who moved well in expensive rooms, and whose relationship with fidelity had not been treated by him as a serious commitment. Grace and Rainier opposed the marriage with a directness that eventually became semi-public. The opposition did not prevent it. The wedding happened in June 1978, and Grace wore an appropriate expression at the appropriate moments, and stood where the cameras required her to stand. The marriage collapsed in 1980. The divorce finalized in 1981. Grace managed the public aftermath, offering Caroline the support her role required her to offer, while privately carrying the sustained dread she had been carrying since 1977, about how this was going to end. The letters Quine describes from Grace in the period of 1980 and 1981 are, in Quine's characterization, letters from a woman who is tired in a particular way, not broken, not despairing, tired in the way that accumulates when you have held many things together for many years and watched the one you most wanted to hold together come apart in precisely the way you had feared it would. That quality of tired is specific. it does not respond well to rest. By the fall of 1982, the aggregate management load Grace was carrying was Stephanie at 17, in active conflict with the palace's expectations, Caroline at 25, rebuilding from a failed marriage, and beginning the relationship with the Italian businessman Stefano Casiraghi that would lead to her second marriage in 1983, Albert at 24, navigating his preparation for the throne, the Red Cross presidency, Armaday, the poetry reading program, the flower art production, the Paris apartment and its organizational function, and the marriage itself, which had settled by this point into the parallel lives configuration that long marriages often settle into when two people have become too separate in their daily existence to maintain the closer arrangement they once had. That is the woman who put Stephanie in the passenger seat of a car on the morning of September 13, 1982, and started driving down a mountain. Before we get into the final chapter, this is a reasonable moment to hit like on this video, if the research has been useful to you. The like helps more people find this kind of work, and this channel operates on audience support, rather than on a production company budget. If there is a figure you would like to see covered in future videos, the comment section is the place to say so. I read them. Now, what actually happened on September 13, 1982? The morning began at Rocagel, the Grimaldi family's private country property, in the hills above Monaco near La Turbie, a village on the French side of the border at elevation, with views across the Mediterranean that make clear why the Grimaldi family had acquired the property. Grace and Stephanie had been there. They were returning to the Palais de Monaco in Monacoville. Grace took the wheel of the family's Rover 3500, a British-made executive sedan kept for personal use rather than official travel. Stephanie, 17 years old, settled into the passenger seat. The route was the Moyenne Corniche. There are 3 coastal roads above Monaco. The Grande Corniche runs at the highest elevation, across the ridgeline above the cliff face, built partly on the route of the old Roman Via Julia Augusta. The Basse Corniche runs at sea level, through the coastal towns. The Moyenne Corniche, the middle road, runs along the cliff face itself, following the natural contours, with a series of switchbacks and blind curves that Napoleon's engineers built into the rock in the early 19th century. It offers, on a clear morning, views of the Mediterranean that photographers have been trying to capture adequately since photography was invented. Under any conditions, it is a road where inattention has serious consequences. The morning of September 13 was clear. The road surface was dry. The conditions were not the cause of what happened. A French truck driver named Yves Biot was traveling behind the Rover on the Moyenne Corniche that morning. His truck was large enough that he had a higher vantage point than an ordinary car driver. He watched the car ahead of him begin to drift on a curve. He watched the brake lights activate briefly and then stop responding. He watched the car strike the low retaining wall along the cliff edge, tip, and go over. He was the only person from a moving vehicle who witnessed the full sequence from the car's drift through the impact and the fall. He was also the first person to stop and report the accident. He gave his testimony to the police on the afternoon of September 13, 1982. He gave the same testimony, in every material detail, in every interview he granted for the remainder of his life, a consistency spanning 4 decades. His account is, a woman matching Grace Kelly's description was in the driver's seat of the Rover, and the car's behavior in the seconds before the impact was consistent with a driver who had suddenly and completely lost control of her right hand. What had happened to Grace's right hand was a cerebrovascular event. A small stroke, in the clinical terminology of the medical examination conducted afterward. The stroke produced a loss of motor control on her right side. It lasted a matter of seconds. On the Moyenne Corniche, at the speed the Rover was traveling, a matter of seconds was enough to put the car off the road. The Rover broke through the retaining wall and fell approximately 120 feet down the mountainside, coming to rest against the terrain above Cap d'Ale, in a tangle of steel and broken glass and brush. Stephanie, in the passenger seat, sustained a hairline fracture in a vertebra and bruising. She was conscious when she climbed out of the passenger side of the wreckage. Emergency services found her at the scene. She was 17 years old, and she had just watched her mother's car go over a cliff. Grace, in the driver's seat, suffered a second and much larger stroke during the fall and impact itself. This was established by the medical examination conducted at the Princess Grace Hospital, where emergency services transported her within a reasonable time frame given the terrain and access conditions. The cerebral hemorrhaging produced by the second stroke was, the medical team established, beyond what the available interventions could reverse. She was alive when the ambulance reached the crash site. She was unconscious when she arrived at the hospital. She did not regain consciousness. Rainier was reached by telephone and arrived at the hospital. He stayed at her bedside through the night and into the following afternoon. The medical team communicated to him over the hours that followed what the prognosis indicated. The damage from the second stroke was irreversible. The decision about when to cease life support fell, by the structure of the family and the principality, to Rainier. He made the decision on September 14, 1982. He signed the paperwork himself. Grace Kelly died that afternoon. On the afternoon of September 13th, after Grace had entered the hospital, and after Rainier had been told by the medical team what they were telling him, the Palace of Monaco issued a press statement. The statement said Princess Grace had suffered a broken leg and broken ribs. It described a serious accident with recoverable injuries. It made no mention of the stroke. It made no mention of the brain hemorrhage. It was not accurate. The world read the statement and drew the obvious conclusion: she would recover. The world waited for the follow-up about her condition improving, about when she would be well enough for visitors, about what the recovery timetable looked like. The follow-up communication was that she had died. 24 hours separated the palace's statement that she had broken ribs and a fractured leg from the palace's announcement that she was dead. Within that 24 hours, every conspiracy theory about Grace Kelly's death was born, and they were born not because anything about the accident was genuinely uncertain or suspicious, but because the palace had told the world a false thing and then told the world a true thing the following day, with no explanation for the gap between them. That gap is where conspiracy theories live and reproduce, and the Palace of Monaco created it with a single communications decision. Why did they issue the false statement? The most credible reading, and the one that accounts for everything the available evidence shows about Rainier's condition in those hours, is that he could not yet say the true words. He had been told what the doctors were telling him. He had not accepted it. The press office issued the statement that reflected the version of reality he was capable of managing at that moment, not the version the medical situation contained. This is a recognizable human response to unbearable news. It is also, in the communication of public information, catastrophic, and the conspiracy theories it generated are the direct and lasting consequence. Had the palace issued an accurate statement on the afternoon of September 13th, saying that the princess had suffered a serious stroke and traumatic brain injury, and was in critical condition with an uncertain prognosis, the world would have grieved, prepared, and received the news of her death the following day, with sadness, but without suspicion. The palace issued a false statement instead, and the world moved from believing she would be discharged from hospital eventually to learning she had died, within 24 hours, with no intermediate stage of honest communication. That transition is the exact shape of a cover-up, even when the underlying events contain nothing that required covering. The palace created the appearance of a cover-up by covering a grief that Rainier was not yet able to disclose publicly. The conspiracy theories that resulted have persisted for 4 decades and deserve precise accounting because they have damaged real people. The most widely circulated claim is that Stephanie was driving the car. This claim rests on no physical evidence. The forensic examination of the crash site placed Stephanie's injuries as consistent with the passenger seat. It placed Grace's injuries as consistent with the driver's seat. Eve Bio's testimony, consistent across 40 years of repetition, identifies the driver as a woman matching Grace Kelly's description. No competing eyewitness testimony exists. No physical evidence contradicts the official account. The claim that Stephanie drove exists because the palace's false press statement created a suspicion environment in which a story of this kind could find an audience, not because the evidence supports it. Stephanie Grimaldi has spent 4 decades being publicly accused of having caused her mother's death. She was 17 years old on September 13, 1982. She was in the passenger seat. She survived a crash that killed the person next to her. The accusation rests on nothing. That is worth stating plainly, without qualification. because the alternative is to extend the courtesy of treating a forensically dead claim as though it remains live. The brake tampering and mafia involvement narratives circulate in a different register of the conspiracy industry and are in the same evidential condition. The forensic examination of the rover found no evidence of mechanical interference. The medical documentation of Grace's cerebrovascular event is consistent with the car's behavior as Bilio described it, and the specific claims about organized crime involvement have never produced any verifiable documentary basis whatsoever. They exist because the palace's communications failure created a gap that various parties found useful for various reasons. The funeral was September 18, 1982. The Cathedral of Our Lady Immaculate in Monaco Ville, the same cathedral where Grace and Rainier had been married 26 years earlier, was filled with delegations, cameras, dignitaries, and the world's press. The footage of the ceremony has been reproduced in every documentary about Grace Kelly made in the 4 decades since, and the reason it has been reproduced is visible immediately to anyone who watches it. In the front pew, in full official dress, Rainier cannot hold his face together. Robert Lacey makes a specific analytical argument in his biography that uses the funeral footage as its centerpiece, and the argument is worth restating directly. The man visible in the footage is not producing calibrated grief for the cameras. He is not managing the expression his role requires. He is not giving the press something usable. He is doing the complete opposite of all of those things, and the reason he is doing the opposite is that whatever resources he would normally deploy to manage his public presentation in a difficult professional moment have been entirely spent. A head of state at a state funeral, in the European monarchical tradition, performs composure. Rainier at Grace Kelly's state funeral did not perform anything. He did not have enough left to. Robert Lacey's point, and it is a point that the footage makes difficult to argue with, is that a man who had spent 26 years making his wife's life a sustained misery does not look like the man in the front pew of that cathedral on September 18, 1982. In the weeks after the funeral, Monaco's governance reasserted its practical demands, as governance always does, and Rainier returned to the work of running the principality. He managed the institutional transition. He managed Monaco's ongoing relationship with France. He managed the SBM, which had by 1982 been fully restored to Grimaldi family control after the Onassis buyout of the 1960s, and which was generating revenues that would have been unrecognizable to the SBM's accountants in 1955. He had been a working head of state for 33 years, and he knew how to keep working when other things required it. He did not remarry. People in his social and professional circle attempted to introduce him to women over the years that followed. The apparatus of European aristocratic social circulation recognized a widowed sovereign prince in his early 60s as a situation requiring attention, and the attention was offered in various forms and from various directions. Rainier declined all of it, or redirected it, or simply did not follow through on any of the introductions that were made, and eventually the effort ceased with any regularity because the pattern was clear enough that continuing to push against it was futile. Her rooms in the palace stayed as she had left them. This is confirmed by multiple accounts from people who visited the palace in the years following 1982. Her personal spaces were not repurposed. The photographs she had chosen remained where she had placed them. The arrangement she had given to the rooms she had inhabited maintained itself. Rainier visited her grave at the Cathedral of Monaco regularly, observed by members of the Monegasque household, without being asked to comment on it. When journalists asked him about Grace in interviews in the years after her death, the accounts of those conversations describe a man who either redirected the conversation or responded in sentences short enough to foreclose follow-up questions. He did not develop a biographical narrative about the marriage for public consumption. He did not give the interviews that would have produced a curated legacy account. He was not interested in performing anything about his wife, including his grief, for public purposes. He died on April 6, 2005. He was 81. He had ruled Monaco for 56 years, the longest reign in the principality's modern history. He had been a widower for 23 of those years. His children arranged for him to be buried in the cathedral crypt beside Grace. The arrangement had been communicated, quietly and in various ways over the preceding 2 decades, as what he wanted. Their names are on the tomb together. There is a summary of this marriage that would be satisfying to produce and would require ignoring most of the evidence to produce it. Two photogenic people, a film festival, a fairy tale, a palace, a crash on a mountain road, resolved and romantic in the way that early death always is, because early death forecloses the messy decades of getting old together and finding each other difficult in the specific ways that time makes available. That version has sold well since April 1956. It will continue to sell. There is a counter-summary that would also be satisfying and would also require ignoring most of the evidence. A scheming prince, a trapped princess, 26 years of control and jealousy and lost ambition. A career murdered by institutional jealousy. A woman who gave up everything and received nothing adequate back. This version also sells, and it has been selling since roughly 2000, when the tabloid biographical tradition discovered its audience for the suffering grace narrative. What the documented record produces is less satisfying than either of those summaries, and considerably more real. A 26-year-old woman, who was exhausted by a studio system that had been extracting her professional identity for 5 years, who had recently lost a relationship she had wanted to continue, and who had a father who had spent her entire adult life refusing to take her most serious work seriously, agreed to a marriage that had been arranged by a priest, a shipping magnate, and a set of SBM quarterly revenue reports, on terms that included a fertility examination administered before the engagement was formalized, and a $2 million financial transaction. She agreed to leave her country, her language, her professional career, and her ability to walk to the corner without security, in exchange for a title and a palace, and the understanding that she could resume acting eventually. She could not resume acting. A tax dispute between France and Monaco, combined with her husband's veto of the one project that would have given her professional life a real second chapter, closed that possibility in 1962 and left it closed for the remaining 20 years of her life. Within those 20 years, she built organizations that still do operational work in the world. The Red Cross of Monaco, with its expanded international capacity. Amadei, with its UN consultative status and its programs in dozens of countries. The Monte Carlo cultural infrastructure that turned a casino town into a place where serious artistic work happened. She performed poetry at the Edinburgh Festival and was reviewed as a professional performer. She produced botanical art that was exhibited in 3 countries and reviewed as art. She raised 3 children who each developed into complicated adults in ways that required sustained and specific attention from her across the final decade of her life. She managed a marriage that had settled, by the last years, into the parallel lives configuration that many long marriages settle into when 2 people have become too separate in their daily existence to maintain the closer arrangement they once had, while also managing Stephanie's teenage crisis and Caroline's post-divorce reconstruction and Albert's preparation for the throne. Her husband was difficult in documented ways, controlling in documented ways, resentful of the fame asymmetry that had been built into the marriage's structure from the beginning, and that expressed itself as restrictions on her professional and personal freedom throughout their time together. He was also not the monster the tabloid tradition requires him to be. The primary sources, including the testimony of the people with the most direct access to the marriage, do not support the narrative that he was a systematic abuser who made Grace's life a sustained misery for 26 years. He was a complicated man in an impossible structural position, who managed the impossibility imperfectly and sometimes badly, and whose failures had real consequences for the person he was married to. He was also the man in the front pew who could not hold his face together at her funeral, and the man who declined every subsequent invitation to replace her, and the man who arranged to be buried next to her when his own time came. Those data points sit at the end of the record. They do not resolve the contradictions between them and everything else the record contains. But they are data points, and they deserve to be read as such, not as validation of the fairy tale, and not as evidence that the dark version was wrong, but as the specific and honest conclusion of a specific and honest story about 2 real people who were placed in a particular situation together and who managed it with varying degrees of capability and failure and occasional genuine feeling across more than a quarter century. Grace Kelly was not the woman the fairy tale describes. She was more complicated, more frustrated, more artistically serious, more politically constrained, and more determined than the fairy tale can contain. She was also not the suffering prisoner the tabloid version requires. She built things inside constrained circumstances. The organizations she left in Monaco are still doing work in the world. Given what she gave up, and what the palace imposed on what she could do with what remained, that outcome is not a small thing. If you stayed through the full video, thank you. This kind of research takes time to do correctly, and it takes an audience willing to sit with a complicated picture rather than a clean verdict. If you found it useful, subscribe if you haven't, leave a comment about someone you'd like to see covered next, and hit like so more people can find this channel. I'll see you in the next one. There is a reason this story has been told in simplified form for so long. The simplified form is genuinely beautiful, in the way that all arrangements of a complicated truth into a clean narrative are beautiful. It has a beginning that reads like fate, a middle that reads like magic, and an ending that reads like tragedy, and the three parts fit together so cleanly that questioning the fit feels almost like an act of bad faith. Grace Kelly, daughter of a Philadelphia brick magnate who had won 3 Olympic rowing medals and who did not think acting was a real job, goes to New York at 18, goes to Hollywood at 21, wins an Oscar at 25, meets a prince at a Cannes Film Festival when she is 25 and he is 32, gets married in a ceremony watched by 30 million people, moves into a palace on the Mediterranean, has 3 children, is killed in a car crash at 52, and is mourned by a husband who never remarries. That narrative has a shape. It satisfies. It asks nothing from you except to feel the appropriate feelings at the appropriate moments. The feeling it asks for at the beginning is wonder. The feeling at the end is grief. Neither wonder nor grief requires you to look at the fertility examination, or the dowry, or the Marnie withdrawal, or the controlling logistics of the household, or the depression documented in the private correspondence. The version of the story that asks you to look at those things is harder to carry. It does not resolve cleanly into wonder and grief. It resolves into something more like recognition, a picture of 2 people in a specific institutional situation, making choices under specific constraints, and paying specific costs for those choices, over a long time, in a way that looks, under examination, like a long marriage between real people, rather than a fairy tale between symbols. That version requires considerably more from an audience than the simplified one. This video is going to require it from you. Let me also say something about what this story meant for the Americans watching it in 1956, because the cultural context matters for understanding why the simplified version took hold as powerfully as it did. Grace Kelly represented something specific to American women of her generation. She was, by the standards of 1955, what the culture wanted women to be: beautiful, composed, educated, Catholic, from a good family, professionally accomplished, without being threatening about it. She wore her intelligence in a way the camera could accept, which is to say she wore it lightly, as a garnish to attractiveness, rather than as the primary thing. She had an Oscar, but she also had cheekbones. The Hollywood studio system had manufactured a version of her that the culture could consume without discomfort, and it had done this work so effectively that the version had largely replaced the actual woman in public perception. Then she married a prince, a literal prince, of a literal country, with a literal palace on a cliff above the Mediterranean, with marble floors and armed guards, and a population of 22,000 people who called her their princess. For American women in 1956, the year that Life magazine covered the wedding with the same resources it would apply to a moon landing, this was not simply a celebrity marriage. It was the confirmation that the fairy tale was real, that the fairy tale was specifically available to American women, if they were beautiful enough and composed enough and accomplished enough, that the work of being the right kind of woman could produce, if you did it correctly, a prince and a palace. Grace Kelly was the evidence. What Grace Kelly actually felt about becoming that evidence is something the private letters to Judith Balaban Quine and her other American friends describe with a specificity that the public face of Princess Grace never communicated. She felt, in the weeks and months after the wedding, the gap between the evidence she was providing for the culture and the actual experience she was having inside it. She was providing evidence for the fairy tale from inside a situation that contained, alongside the genuine warmth between her and Rainier in those early months, a medical examination administered before the engagement, a $2 million financial transaction, a palace full of staff whose loyalty ran to her husband, a country that had not yet decided what it thought of her, and a professional identity she had been told she would eventually be able to resume. She was 26. She did not yet know that the last part was not true. The gap between what she was providing to the culture and what she was actually experiencing was the gap that the fairy tale has been filling, in the 40 years since her death, with whatever material audiences and biographers found most useful. The material has varied, the gap has not. The specific texture of Grace Kelly's life in New York before Monaco is worth dwelling on, because it establishes what she was trading away in April 1956, and why the trade was simultaneously reasonable from her position in 1955, and more costly than she had been able to anticipate. She had lived in Manhattan from 1947, when she arrived at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts at 18, until the wedding in 1956, 9 years in the city. Her apartment on East 63rd Street, the one with the photographers outside the building in the years of her Hollywood fame, was the apartment of a working professional woman in mid-century New York, small, organized around function, containing the books she was reading, and the scripts she was working on, and the clothes she wore to auditions, and to the television studios where she shot live dramatic productions in the early 1950s. The American Academy had trained her in the discipline of the craft, and the live television work that followed the Academy extended the training in the specific direction of doing it under pressure, in front of cameras, in real time, with no ability to go back and do the scene again if something went wrong. She did dozens of live TV dramas in the early 1950s. That training is part of what Hitchcock recognized when he saw her, and part of what made her performances hold up under the specific kind of scrutiny his camera applied. She loved New York in the way that people love the city they discover themselves in. She walked, she went to the theater, she read extensively, always, and the reading was not decorative, but professional, in the sense that it fed directly into the kind of performer she was becoming. She maintained friendships with a circle of women who were also working in the arts and the entertainment industry in New York, and those friendships had the quality of real mutual observation, the kind that forms between people who are watching each other develop and who have enough shared context to see what the development means. Judith Balaban Quine was part of that circle. The friendships those women formed in New York in the early 1950s were the friendships that survived Monaco and the Palace and the 26 years of correspondence, because they were friendships formed between real people rather than between celebrities managing their public relationships. When she moved to Hollywood, she kept the New York apartment. She shot her films in California and flew back to New York between productions, because the apartment and the city were where she could be a private person rather than a studio property, and the distinction mattered to her enough to maintain it at the cost of considerable travel. MGM would have preferred her in California, where they could manage her image more comprehensively. She preferred New York, where the management was less comprehensive. She won that particular negotiation for several years. Her mother Margaret came to visit in New York regularly, and the relationship between Grace and Margaret was, by the accounts that survive it, considerably warmer than the relationship with Jack. Margaret Kelly was herself a person of considerable self-discipline and carefully maintained presentation, not given to easy emotional expression, but she had a steady interest in Grace's life and development that expressed itself in practical engagement rather than the withholding endorsement that Jack practiced. She was the parent Grace called when something had happened that she needed to process with someone who would not tell her that she should be doing something else entirely. When the Monaco engagement was announced in January 1956, Margaret Kelly came to Monaco with Grace for parts of the engagement period and for the wedding preparations. She was photographed at the wedding, composed and appropriate, wearing the expression of a woman who has thought carefully about what expression to wear for photographs in a cathedral with 30 million viewers. What she said privately to Grace about the engagement in the weeks and months between January and April of 1956 is not preserved in any source that has been made available to biographers. What the subsequent years suggest is that she continued to be engaged with Grace's life in Monaco in the practical, regular way she had always been engaged with it, visiting regularly, maintaining correspondence, representing to Grace the American life she had left in a form that was specific and personal rather than merely symbolic. Jack Kelly died in 1960. He died before he had the chance to revise his opinion of his daughter's career, based on what she had built by then, and before he had the chance to see what the palace did to it afterward. Whether his opinion would have revised if he had lived longer is a question that has no adequate answer. The specific shape of Monaco's geography is worth understanding in more detail than the story typically provides, because the geography is what made the Franco-Monegasque Treaty of 1918 both necessary and consequential in the specific way it was. Monaco is 2.1 square kilometers at its current area, and it was smaller than that in 1955 before the land reclamation projects that Rainier funded in the 1960s and 1970s added territory by extending the principality into the sea. It is surrounded on 3 sides by France, on the 4th by the Mediterranean. The French border is not a distant diplomatic abstraction. In some places, it is a street. In some places, it is a building wall. A person standing in certain parts of Monaco can take 3 steps and be in France. The Principality's complete dependence on French roads, French water supply, French electricity grid, and French trade routes is not a strategic vulnerability. It is a geographic fact, and Charles de Gaulle was entirely aware of it when he announced his customs barriers. The Grimaldi family's connection to Monaco dates to 1297, when François Grimaldi disguised himself as a Franciscan monk and captured the fortress that then occupied the Rock of Monaco, establishing a dynasty that has maintained its hold on the territory for more than 7 centuries, through French annexation during the Revolutionary period, through the loss of the surrounding communes of Menton and Roquebrune to France in the 1860s, through the First World War and the treaty that came with it, through the Second World War and the German occupation of the Riviera, through the post-war Casino slump and the Onassis challenge and the de Gaulle confrontation. The Grimaldi survival across 7 centuries is a specific institutional achievement that Rainier was acutely conscious of, and that gave him a particular orientation toward existential threats, patient, determined, and willing to accept short-term costs for long-term institutional preservation. He applied this orientation to the de Gaulle confrontation, to the Onassis situation, and to his own marriage in ways that were not always comfortable for the people around him, but that consistently protected the institution he had been born to protect. Rainier's personal history before Grace is relevant to understanding what the marriage meant to him. He had grown up largely separated from his parents. His mother, Princess Charlotte, had been disinherited from the succession in 1944, and his father, Prince Pierre of Monaco, was a French diplomat and nobleman who had been a relatively peripheral figure in Monaco's governance. Rainier had been educated partly in England, at Summerfield's Preparatory School, and then at Stowe School in Buckinghamshire, and partly in Switzerland, at the Institut Le Rosey, the boarding school whose alumni directory reads like a survey of 20th-century European royalty. He had served in the French army during the Second World War, reaching the rank of lieutenant before the end of the conflict. He had assumed the throne at 26 and had been managing it, with mixed results, for 6 years when Grace arrived in his life. The 6-year relationship with Giselle Pascal deserves more attention than it typically gets in accounts of Grace Kelly's story, because it illuminates something about what Rainier was willing to accept and what the palace would not. Pascal was a genuine relationship. Not a ceremonial attachment, not a public relations arrangement, but something that people close to Rainier consistently describe as emotionally substantive. The palace ended it, based on a medical examination whose reliability several biographers have since questioned. Whether the examination was accurate or not, the palace's willingness to terminate a 6-year relationship on the basis of an institutional requirement tells you something about the operating logic of the Grimaldi household that Grace Kelly entered in April 1956. The institution came first. The institution had always come first. The institution would continue to come first after the wedding, in ways that Grace had not been given a fully candid account of before she agreed to it. The weeks between the December 1955 visit to Monaco and the January 5, 1956 engagement announcement were, by the accounts of people who were close to Grace during this period, weeks of genuine deliberation. She was not swept into the engagement on the momentum of the romantic narrative that the press was already constructing around the Paris match photograph and the subsequent letter writing. She thought about it. She talked about it with friends and with her mother. She asked questions that people around her remember, because the questions were specific and serious, rather than the kind that a woman swept up in romance typically asks. Judith Balaban Quine, who had conversations with Grace during this period, and who describes them in The Bridesmaids, portrays a woman who was clear-eyed about what she was agreeing to in specific ways, even as she was uncertain about what it would feel like to live inside what she was agreeing to. Grace understood that she was agreeing to give up her career, at least for a period. She understood that she was agreeing to live in a country where she did not fully speak the language. She understood that she was agreeing to produce children quickly because there was a treaty that required it. She understood that the principality she was moving to was an institution with its own history and its own logic, and that the logic did not include making room for her professional ambitions in any form she could currently envision. She understood all of these things. What she told friends was that she believed she could find a way through them, that the palace would not be forever, that she would find the path back to work eventually. She was wrong about the last part, but she was not naive about the rest of it. What she was less clear about, because no one had given her adequate information about it, and because she had not yet experienced it from the inside, was the specific texture of institutional isolation that the palace imposed. She knew she was giving up Manhattan. She did not yet know what it would feel like to want to make a phone call and to understand that the call was a palace event. She knew she was giving up her professional independence. She did not yet know what it would feel like to watch that independence recede in the specific way that Rainier's management of her schedule expressed, not through explicit prohibition, but through the accumulation of logistical controls that added up to the same thing. She knew the palace had its own logic. She did not yet know how completely that logic would govern the available choices. These are things you learn from the inside. Grace learned them from the inside, and she communicated what she was learning to her American friends in letters that carry, underneath their composure, the specific texture of a person adjusting to conditions more constraining than she had anticipated. The honeymoon cruise on the Deo Giovante II took Grace and Rainier through the Mediterranean in the April and early May of 1956. The yacht was photographed at intervals by the International Press Corps that tracked its progress, so the honeymoon was not private in any ordinary sense. It was observed, photographed, reported on. The couple managed this in the way that public figures manage being observed on what is nominally a private occasion, which is by maintaining appropriate expressions and appropriate distances from each other at moments when cameras were pointing at them, and by managing whatever the private experience actually was in the spaces between camera positions. What the space between camera positions contained, in terms of the actual dynamic between two people who had spent a total of approximately 2 weeks in each other's physical company before being married, is something that the available sources address only glancingly. Rainier was, by the accounts of people who knew him in private, warmer and more personally open than his public manner communicated. He had a sense of humor that the official photographs did not capture. He was genuinely curious about animals and the natural world and boats and cars and a wide range of things that a man who spent his professional life running a principality the size of Central Park had found time to develop genuine expertise in, partly because the scale of the principality made depth of engagement possible in ways that ruling a larger country would not have permitted. Grace was, by Quine's account, relieved in the early weeks after the wedding to discover that the man she had married was more interesting and more real in private than she had been able to establish from 10 days of formal acquaintance. The warmth between them in the early years was genuine, however complicated the structure within which it operated. The complications began asserting themselves in the first months after the honeymoon ended, and the couple returned to Monaco for the business of actually running a principality. Rainier returned to the work of being a head of state. Grace returned to the work of learning what being a princess actually required, which was considerably more extensive than the engagement period had communicated. The official schedule of a Princess of Monaco in 1956 involved charitable engagements, state dinners, official receptions, ceremonial appearances at events that ranged from the Monaco Grand Prix to the Red Cross Gala to the annual Monegasque National Day celebrations. Each of these required preparation, appropriate dress, prepared remarks in 2 languages, and the maintenance of a public persona that was simultaneously warm and dignified, accessible and regal, American and European. The demands were not trivial. They were also not what Grace Kelly's training had prepared her for, because her training had prepared her for the craft of performing, not for the craft of being. The distinction is significant. The princess role required her to be, rather than to perform, to inhabit a public identity as her actual identity, rather than as a character she had chosen to play. For someone who had spent her adult professional life in the deliberate separation between herself and the roles she played, the collapse of that separation into a single ongoing public identity was a specific and sustained adjustment. By the time Princess Caroline arrived in January 1957, Grace had been in Monaco for less than a year and had been managing the transition, the language, the staff, the social temperature of the Monegasque court, and the official schedule, simultaneously and without adequate preparation. She was also, as Caroline's arrival demonstrated, pregnant. She had been pregnant for the first several months of her new life in Monaco. Her first significant public appearance in Monaco after the wedding, at the 1956 Monaco Grand Prix in May, which Rainier attended as the sovereign of the principality, where one of the world's most famous motor races takes place, was made while she was newly pregnant, managing the physical effects of early pregnancy, while also managing the social effects of being in her first major public appearance as the new Princess of Monaco. The Hermès bag she carried in photographs from this period became, in retrospect, one of the most famous fashion accessories of the 20th century, because the photographs showed her holding it across her abdomen in a way that effectively concealed the pregnancy from the press. Hermès renamed the bag the Kelly in 1977, in recognition of what the photographs had made of it. The question of what Rainier did with the Onassis situation in the years after the wedding illuminates something about the kind of man he was that the simplified narratives, both the fairy tale and the tabloid version, tend to obscure. He was not a passive figure. He was a working politician and institutional operator who had specific strategic goals and who pursued them with patience and method, even when the immediate situation was not favorable. Onassis had inserted himself into Monaco's economy through a share acquisition that Rainier had not been consulted about, and that represented, in the prince's analysis, a direct challenge to the principality's sovereignty. A Greek shipping magnate who owned a controlling interest in the SBM owned, effectively, a controlling interest in Monaco's economy, and Rainier did not consider this a situation that could persist indefinitely. He began working to address it in the early 1960s, after the tourist revenues had recovered sufficiently, in part because of Grace's presence, to give Monaco the financial capacity to fund a buyback. The process required years and considerable financial engineering. Rainier restructured Monaco's relationship with the SBM in stages, each stage moving more of the company's effective control from Onassis toward the principality. He issued Monaco citizenship to enough new residents, many of them wealthy Europeans and Americans who were attracted to Monaco's tax status, to change the demographic composition of the SBM's shareholder base. He worked through the mechanisms available to a head of state, who was also, as the largest single shareholder in the SBM, a major corporate stakeholder. By 1966 and 1967, he had succeeded in engineering the outcome he had been working toward. Onassis was effectively removed from any meaningful influence over the SBM. The man who had helped design the marriage that made the buyback financially possible was expelled from the institution his investment had helped stabilize. Rainier, who had a long institutional memory and a patient strategic approach, had been working toward this outcome since approximately 1957. He got there in a decade. Onassis married Jacqueline Kennedy in 1968, deploying his specific understanding of the American Facer's marketing asset strategy on his own behalf, and moved his attention to other large-scale interests. He and Rainier maintained a civil public relationship in the years that followed, because Monaco's position in the Mediterranean required it to maintain civil public relationships with powerful people, even when those relationships contained unresolved grievances. The civility was professional rather than personal. The grievance was not forgotten. This capacity for patient strategic operation, for working toward a goal over a decade through mechanisms that did not announce themselves as opposition, is the same capacity that showed itself in Rainier's management of the Mani situation. He did not veto the Mani project with a direct and explicit prohibition. He opposed it through the logistical and political management of the conditions around it, allowing the de Gaulle crisis to provide the official cover for the outcome he had already decided to produce. He was not a crude man, he was a sophisticated operator who had spent his entire adult life managing a sovereignty smaller than Central Park, in the middle of a powerful neighbor who had the ability to swallow it whenever it chose. Sophistication in that position is not a luxury. It is the condition of survival. The months immediately after the Mani withdrawal were the months when Grace's correspondence with her American friends most clearly documented what the marriage had been costing her. Judith Balaban Quine describes letters from this period in The Bridesmaids that do not use the language of clinical depression, because Grace did not use that language about herself, but that carry its shape, a description of days that are full of tasks and empty of the specific quality of engagement that the tasks do not provide. She was doing the official work, she was appearing at the galas and the charity events and the state dinners and the Red Cross board meetings. She was managing a household with 2 young children and a third on the way. She was doing all of it with the composure that her training had made automatic. And she was carrying something, under the composure, that she described to Quine and to other friends as a weight without adequate language. She had given up something that did not have a replacement. The Red Cross work was real, and she knew it was real, but it was not the same as the camera knowing something about you that you cannot show it any other way. The poetry readings that she would eventually develop with Westbrook were still more than a decade in the future. The flower art had not yet started. She was in the specific gap between losing the thing that had defined her and finding anything that could function in its place, and the gap was not a comfortable place to be. What the letters also show, in Quine's characterization, is that Grace did not blame Rainier for this in explicit terms, even to her closest friends. She was not a person who communicated her injuries directly. She was a person who had been trained from childhood, by a household that did not accommodate the expression of self-pity, to manage her difficulties through discipline rather than disclosure. The letters show the weight she was carrying. They do not show her placing the weight on Rainier by name. Whether this was accurate emotional accounting or the specific kind of composure that protects a marriage by never quite saying the thing that cannot be unsaid, is a question the letters do not answer, and may have been a question Grace herself was not ready to answer during those years. Stephanie was born February 1, 1965. She was the 3rd child, and by the time she arrived, the family's internal dynamic was established in forms that would persist through the rest of the marriage. Rainier was the authority, Grace was the warmth. The children navigated between the 2 poles, developing, each in their own way, the particular skill set that children develop when the 2 most important adults in their lives operate from fundamentally incompatible ideas about what an adult is supposed to provide. The specific texture of the parenting conflict showed itself most clearly in the question of education. Rainier preferred French, which was the official language of the Principality and of European aristocratic convention. Grace insisted on English, which was her language, and the children's access to their American half. They answered her in English, even when their father preferred otherwise. She read to them in English, even in French rooms. The children grew up bilingual in a way that the palace had not designed, and Rainier had not fully anticipated, and the bilingualism became a resource that each of them drew on in different ways in their adult lives. Albert's American college experience at Amherst was made possible, in part by the English that Grace had maintained against the household's French preference. Albert went to Amherst College in Massachusetts as an undergraduate, and then trained with the International Olympic Committee and developed a career as a bobsled athlete that took him to 5 Olympic Games. He also worked as an intern at various American businesses during his college years, developing a fluency with American commercial culture that had no equivalent in the European royal households of his generation. Grace was the author of that American strand of Albert's formation, and the formation shows in the adult he became, more at ease across cultural registers than most European royals of his generation, more genuinely engaged with the world beyond the palace's social circuit, more capable of the kind of human directness that institutional royalty tends to train out of people. The Grimaldi family curse is the piece of context that appears in every account of this family's marital history, and that the family itself neither confirms nor denies with any enthusiasm. The legend dates to the late 13th century and involves a Grimaldi prince who seduced a young woman who revealed herself to be a witch and who placed on his lineage a curse that no Grimaldi would ever find true happiness in marriage. The story is medieval mythology, and no member of the current family treats it as a predictive framework. It is, however, a piece of cultural context that the press in Monaco and France reaches for reflexively whenever a Grimaldi marriage ends badly, and the marital record of the dynasty provides a fairly regular supply of occasions for the reach. What the curse actually represents, in a less supernatural reading, is a long-form description of an institutional pattern. The Grimaldi family has been managing a tiny sovereign state under existential pressure from a powerful neighbor for 7 centuries. The pressures of that management have historically expressed themselves in marriage choices made for institutional rather than personal reasons, in heirs produced on diplomatic rather than emotional timetables, in spouses selected for what they brought to the principality rather than for what they brought to the person marrying them. That pattern produces marriages that are organized around institutional function from the beginning, and marriages organized around institutional function do not, in general, produce the kind of personal happiness that results from people choosing each other freely. This is not a supernatural phenomenon. It is a predictable consequence of a specific institutional logic operating over a long time. Grace Kelly walked into that institutional logic in April 1956. She walked into it with her eyes as open as they could be given the information available to her, which was not complete, and she spent 26 years managing the consequences of that walk, with varying success and at a cost that was real, but that did not produce the disaster the tabloid version of this story requires it to have produced. The last public appearance Grace Kelly made before the crash was in Sweden, where she had traveled in early September 1982 for an Amadei-related event. She was there in her capacity as the organization's founder and president, doing the kind of international organizational work that she had been doing for nearly 20 years. The Amadei event was in Stockholm. She flew back to Monaco and then drove up to Rockagel with Rainier and the children in the days before September 13th. The photographs from Stockholm show a woman who is, by any visible assessment, in full operational condition, present, engaged, appropriate to the setting. There is nothing in the photographs that reads as decline. She had been, in the final months before the crash, dealing simultaneously with Stephanie's latest round of negotiations over what Stephanie was and was not going to do with her life, and with the Red Cross's upcoming annual gala preparations, and with a new batch of flower art she was developing for an upcoming exhibition. She had been on the phone with Quine. She had been in contact with Westbrook about future poetry reading dates. She had been doing, in other words, exactly what the evidence shows her doing throughout the preceding 2 decades, which is running multiple things simultaneously inside constraints that had not loosened since the palace imposed them in the first years of the marriage. The morning of September 13, 1982, began at Rockagel, with the ordinary logistics of a family leaving a country house for the palace. Grace took the wheel of the Rover 3500. Stephanie got into the passenger seat. They started down the Moyenne Corniche. The road runs approximately 40 minutes from La Turbie to Monaco under normal driving conditions, and normal conditions prevailed that morning. Clear sky, dry road surface, September temperature in the low 20s. Nothing about the conditions suggested anything except an ordinary drive on a dramatic road that Grace Kelly had driven many times before. The Grimaldis used Rockagel regularly as a retreat from the palace's official atmosphere, and the drive between the country property and Monaco was routine for the family. What was not routine was the cerebrovascular event that struck Grace approximately halfway down the Corniche. The medical evidence for its occurrence is clear in the forensic record. The pattern of the car's behavior before the crash, the first and sudden loss of directional control, the brief activation of the brakes followed by their complete failure to operate, all are consistent with a driver who has suddenly and completely lost function on one side of her body. A small stroke, in the clinical description, a temporary and catastrophic interruption of the motor signals that the right side of a right-handed person's body depends on, for the kind of precise physical control that keeping a car on a mountain road requires. Yves Biot's truck was traveling behind the rover at a distance that gave him a clear sightline to everything that happened. He was driving a large commercial vehicle, which means his vantage point was higher than that of an ordinary car driver, and which means the perspective from his cab on the sequence of events was both unobstructed and from a slightly elevated angle that gave him more visual information than he would have had in a standard passenger vehicle. He watched the rover drift. He watched the brake lights. He watched the retaining wall come up. He watched the car go over. He was consistent about every element of this across 4 decades of being asked about it. Consistency of that character and duration, in accounts given by a witness who has no stake in any particular version of events, is the kind of evidence that forensic analysis takes seriously. The fall was approximately 120 feet. The terrain below the Moyenne Corniche on that section of the road consists of steep slope covered in brush and scrub vegetation, dropping to the area above Cap d'Aile, where the land meets the sea. The rover came to rest against the terrain, badly damaged. Stephanie got out of the passenger side. What happened medically in the immediate aftermath of the crash was the second stroke. The fall and the impact produced the cerebral hemorrhaging that the first small stroke, in isolation, would not have produced. The first event had been small enough, in the clinical assessment, that it would likely have been survivable if Grace had been stopped and treated immediately when it happened, as a driver who feels a stroke coming might stop if she had sufficient warning and sufficient motor control to stop before the loss of function was complete. She did not have sufficient warning or sufficient motor control. The car went over before any of that was possible. The Princess Grace Hospital in Monaco received her within the time frame that the terrain and access conditions allowed. She was alive. She was unconscious. She did not regain consciousness. The 24 hours that Rainier spent at the hospital between the afternoon of September 13 and Grace's death on September 14 are described in various accounts by people who knew what was happening inside the hospital during those hours. Geoffrey Robinson's account, based on cooperation with the palace household, describes a man who had been told by the medical team what the prognosis indicated and who was not yet able to move from that information to the decision the information required. The decision to cease life support is not a decision that admits of careful, methodical strategic processing. It is a decision that has to be made in the immediate human terms of the person sitting in the hospital chair next to the bed. And Rainier had been doing his strategic processing on institutional timelines for 33 years. This was not that. He signed the paperwork on September 14th. He did it himself. Grace Kelly died on September 14th, 1982. She was 52 years old. She had been Princess of Monaco for 26 years and 4 months. She had been, in that time, the most internationally recognizable figure associated with Monaco in the country's modern history, the founder of organizations that still do operational charitable work, the president of an institution whose capacity she had expanded from ceremonial to executive, the mother of 3 children who each grew into complicated adults in ways that reflect the specific household they were raised in, and a person who had found, in the narrow space the palace permitted between the career she had lost and the career she could not have, a form of artistic practice that she used with professional seriousness for the last decade of her life. The Princess Grace Foundation, established after her death by Rainier, with support from her American friends and professional contacts, continues to operate in the United States as a charitable organization distributing grants to emerging artists in theater, dance, and film. It is not a large foundation by the standards of major American philanthropies. It does sustained work. Grace had also, in the last decade of her life, become interested in tracing her Irish ancestry, which ran through the Kelly family's origins in County Mayo, and had planned a visit to Ireland that the crash prevented. The connection was not purely sentimental. She had been developing relationships with Irish cultural institutions and with the Irish American community as an expression of an identity that the palace and its French and European orientation did not naturally accommodate. The Kelly family's Mayo origins were, for Grace, a thread that led back to something older and less governed by protocol than anything the Monegasque court provided. Rainier funded the construction of the Princess Grace Irish Library in Monaco, opened in 1984, 2 years after her death. The library holds a collection of Irish literature and cultural materials and functions as a research centre for scholars working on Irish studies. It is not the largest Irish studies institution in the world. It is, like the other things that bear her name and continue her work, an institutional expression of something she had been building toward in her own time and on her own terms. The funeral footage. Let me return to it, because everything this video has covered in the preceding 2 hours and 25 minutes resolves into that footage and into what it means. September 18, 1982. Monaco Ville. The Cathedral of Our Lady Immaculate. The same building where Grace and Rainier had been married on April 19, 1956. He sat in the front pew. He was 60 years old. He had been ruling Monaco for 33 years. He had spent 26 of them married to the woman whose coffin was in the church. The footage shows a man who cannot perform what his role requires. European heads of state at state funerals perform. They perform grief in a calibrated way that communicates appropriate feeling without communicating the loss of institutional control that fully expressed grief would represent. They do this because the performance is the function, because a head of state who loses composure at a state funeral is communicating instability rather than mourning, and instability in a head of state is a political message that has political consequences. Rainier had attended and hosted state ceremonies for 33 years. He knew this. His face ignored it. He wept. He wept the way people weep when they have nothing left to spend on composure. The camera caught it, and the footage has been reproduced in every documentary about this story in the 40 years since, because it is one of the few moments in this entire story where the gap between what the public was shown and what the private reality contained is zero. He was not performing for the cameras. He could not perform for the cameras. Whatever the marriage had been, and whatever it had cost, and whatever the complexity of the specific dynamic between these two specific people, across 26 years of living inside a palace and a principality, and a set of institutional requirements that neither of them had chosen, on September 18, 1982, none of that was what his face was doing. Robert Lacey is right that this is evidence of something. It is not conclusive evidence that the marriage was a love story in the uncomplicated sense the fairy tale requires. The documented record contains too many complications for that. But it is evidence that the man in the front pew had not spent 26 years tormenting a woman he did not care about. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, and the tabloid tradition has treated them as though they were. In the years after the funeral, each of the three children moved through their own version of the aftermath. Caroline married Stefano Casiraghi in 1983, the year after Grace's death, and had 3 children with him before his death in a powerboat racing accident in 1990. She subsequently married Ernst August of Hanover. She has been the most publicly engaged of the 3 children in Monaco's civic life, the one who has most consistently shown up at the official functions and carried the Grimaldi institutional obligations forward in the way Grace had carried them during the marriage. Albert assumed the throne in 2005 and married the South African swimmer Charlene Wittstock in 2011. They have twins, born 2014. Stephanie had children with 3 different partners and married twice, neither marriage lasting, and has spent her adult life in the specific way that someone spends their adult life when they were raised in a palace that required performances they were never willing to give. At a distance from the institution, closer to the edges of the social world it inhabits, more honest in her public behavior about what she actually feels than any other Grimaldi of her generation, which has made her alternately sympathetic and alarming to the press and public that follow the family. She has spoken about the crash only rarely and always briefly. The few public statements she has made about the morning of September 13, 1982, are consistent with the forensic record and with BO's testimony, and they carry the specific texture of statements made by someone carrying something very heavy for a very long time. She was 17 years old when it happened. She survived. She has been accused by the conspiracy industry that the palace's false press statement created of having caused it. The accusation is forensically groundless. It is also, for the person it is directed at, a specific and ongoing cost of the palace's failure to be honest with the world on the afternoon of her mother's hospitalization. The question this video started with was what kind of marriage produces the footage of Rainier weeping at the cathedral on September 18, 1982. 2.5 hours later, the answer is the kind of marriage that the documented record of this marriage actually shows, which is not the fairy tale and not the tabloid nightmare, but something more durable than either. A long marriage between two specific people who were placed together by institutional need and financial negotiation, and a strategic reading of quarterly casino revenue reports, who found in each other things that were real, alongside things that were frustrating, and things that were costly, and things that were, in the record of 26 years, apparently irreplaceable. The irreplaceability is the data point at the end. 23 years alone, never remarried, buried next to her. Those are the facts that sit at the conclusion of this story, and they resist the simplification that the fairy tale and the tabloid version alike impose on it. Grace Kelly was not what the fairy tale required her to be. She was more interesting, more frustrated, more artistically serious, more politically constrained, more determined, and more costly to the institutional logic that produced her marriage than the fairy tale could accommodate. She built things. She built them inside constraints severe enough that building them at all required the kind of sustained professional commitment that the decline narrative specifically denies her. The Red Cross of Monaco and the World Association of Children's Friends are operational institutions that exist in the present tense because she built them in the past tense, inside a palace that was not designed to accommodate that kind of building. Rainier was not what the tabloid version required him to be either. He was not a simple villain, and he was not a straightforward hero. He was a man who ran a small, pressured sovereignty with considerable institutional skill, and who brought to his marriage the same authoritarian approach he brought to his governance, which was effective at producing results and costly to the people who had to live inside it. He was resentful of the fame asymmetry the marriage required him to carry, and he expressed that resentment through the control of logistics in ways that had real consequences for Grace's professional and personal life. He was also the man in the cathedral on September 18th, and the man who stayed alone for 23 years after, and the man who went into the ground next to her when it was over. That is the story, all of it, together. If you stayed through this entire video, thank you. Subscribe if you haven't, leave a comment about who you want to see covered next, hit like so more people find this kind of research. See you in the next one. There is additional material in this story that sits between the sections already covered, and that fills in the picture in ways that matter. The relationship between Grace and Rainier in the specific years between 1963 and 1970 is one of the least discussed periods in the biographical literature, possibly because it is the period that most resists both the fairy tale and the tabloid readings. It was not a honeymoon period, and it was not yet the parallel lives arrangement that characterized the final decade. It was a period of adjustment to what the marriage had actually become, after the Marnie withdrawal made its permanent shape clear, and that adjustment took place against the background of the de Gaulle confrontation and the Onassis buyout, and the birth of Stephanie in 1965, and the specific social world of Monaco in the 1960s. The Monte Carlo social season in the 1960s was a particular environment. The Principality had recovered its American tourist traffic after Grace's arrival, and the SBM's revenues had stabilized and then grown, and the Monaco Grand Prix had by the early 1960s become one of the fixed points of the European motor racing calendar, drawing the Formula One teams and their associated glamour to the Principality's streets every May. The streets themselves, which served as the racing circuit, were closed to ordinary traffic during Grand Prix weekend, and transformed into something that required the Principality's entire administrative capacity to manage. Grace was present at the Grand Prix annually, in the official capacity that the Principality's premier sporting event required of its princess, and she fulfilled the role with the same precision she applied to everything the official schedule demanded. She also developed, over the course of the 1960s, a social circle within Monaco and on the broader Riviera that was more genuinely her own than the Monegasque aristocratic circuit she had been deposited into in 1956. David Niven and his wife Hjordis had a property in the south of France and circulated through the Monaco social world regularly enough to become a consistent presence in Grace's life. Niven was one of the people she could have a real conversation with, a person who had built a substantial career in the same industry she had left, and who understood, without requiring explanation, what the giving up of that career had meant. His wife was another person who had navigated the specific complexities of being married to a very famous man in a very public environment, and the two women had a mutual understanding that had nothing to do with either of their husbands' professional situations. The American expatriate community on the Riviera provided a related resource. Monaco and the surrounding French coast had accumulated, by the 1960s, a population of Americans who had moved to the region for various combinations of the tax environment and the climate and the social world it produced, and Grace was the most prominent of them, which meant that every American who arrived on the Riviera with any social standing came to her attention eventually. This gave her a form of American social life that was not identical to what New York had provided, but that was not nothing either. She could have lunch with people who understood the United States from the inside rather than from a European remove, people who thought of American informality as a natural condition rather than a cultural curiosity. The relationship between Grace and Rainier from 1963 onward was also shaped, in ways the simplified accounts tend to underweight, by the work they did together on Monaco's institutional future. They disagreed about many things in private, and they managed those disagreements in the ways that couples in complicated marriages manage disagreements, which is with varying success at various moments. But they worked on Monaco together, with a consistency and a shared orientation that the people who observed them at close range consistently note. They agreed on what Monaco needed to become. They agreed on the direction of the Principality's development. They agreed on the importance of the SBM buyback from Onassis, and they worked on it together. They agreed on the importance of building Monaco's international cultural profile, and they worked on that together. The things they disagreed about were real and they mattered, and the things they agreed about were also real and they also mattered. And the account of the marriage that contains only the disagreements is as partial as the account that contains only the shared work. Grace's fashion became, over the course of the 1960s and into the 1970s, a subject in its own right. She had arrived in Monaco in 1956, with the wardrobe of a Hollywood actress, the carefully designed studio-era clothes that MGM's costume department had helped assemble for the woman who was simultaneously their most celebrated current property and their most photogenic. The Monaco court required something different, a European formality that the Hollywood wardrobe addressed only partially, and an aristocratic discretion that the studio's tendency toward visual impact sometimes worked against. Grace developed, over the years of her marriage, a personal aesthetic that the fashion press tracked with genuine interest. Simpler, more structurally restrained, more reliant on tailoring than on surface decoration, more European in its general orientation than the Hollywood glamour that had preceded it. The Hermes Kelly bag remained in her collection throughout. She carried it with the ease of someone who has had the same tool for a long time and no longer thinks about the fact of carrying it. Her relationship with clothes was practical, in the way that the relationship of a woman who is photographed every time she appears in public tends to be practical. She understood that every public appearance was also a piece of communication, and she managed what the communication said with the same precision she managed everything else. The shift in her style over the 26 years of the marriage, from the composed Hollywood glamour of the late 1950s to the quieter European formality of the 1970s and 1980s, tracks the broader shift in her orientation away from the public figure that MGM had constructed and toward whatever she had become after 26 years of building it herself, in Monaco's specific context. The Edinburgh Festival appearances with John Westbrook in the mid to late 1970s deserve more attention than they typically receive in accounts of Grace Kelly's life, because they represent the clearest evidence available of what she could still do with the instrument she had trained, and what the instrument had become after 20 years of being used primarily for speaking at official dinners and reading to her children. The Edinburgh Festival is a specific environment. It is not a gala where a princess performs a reading because she is a princess. It is a professional arts festival where work is reviewed on its merits by critics whose professional identity is not organized around being kind to the titled. Grace appeared there as a performer, which is what she was, and the reviews responded to what she did as performance rather than as gesture. The programs she and Westbrook developed drew on English-language poetry from multiple periods, the kind of selection that requires genuine literary knowledge to assemble and genuine technical skill to perform convincingly, because the range of the material exposes any weakness in the performer's command of register and tone. She had the command. The reviews said so. The flower art exhibitions in Paris, New York, and Tokyo in the late 1970s and early 1980s were received with a similar seriousness. Botanical illustration is a discipline with established technical standards, and pressed flower art as a medium has its own aesthetic conventions that distinguish skilled from unskilled practitioners, with a clarity that the galleries in which Grace's work appeared did not obscure. The works were reviewed in the gallery press and in the broader art press as works, not as princess hobbies. The gallery in Paris that showed them was not operating as a favor to Monaco's sovereign. It showed them because the work was adequate to the gallery's standards. The Tokyo exhibition was reviewed in Japanese arts publications that had no particular reason to be generous about European pressed flower art from a political figure they had no direct relationship with. The reviews were specific and professional. The works held up. This point about the botanical art matters for the larger argument about what Grace Kelly was doing in the years the decline narrative assigns to elegant uselessness, because it requires the decline narrative to account for work that was produced to a standard that critics without any stake in the narrative found adequate. The decline narrative cannot easily accommodate this, because its organizing principle is the collapse of a brilliant woman's creative capacity under the weight of a constraining marriage. The operational record of the Red Cross, the organizational development of Amadei, the Edinburgh Festival reviews, and the gallery exhibitions in 3 countries do not fit that organizing principle. They fit a different one, which is, a brilliant woman found the narrow openings available within a constraining institutional situation and used them with full professional commitment over a sustained period. The parallel is not comfortable, because the most flattering version of it is still a picture of someone working in severely reduced circumstances compared to what she would have had if the situation had been different. But the most accurate version of it is not the decline narrative. The question of what Grace Kelly and Rainier actually said to each other in the private spaces of the marriage is one that the biographical literature addresses obliquely, because the direct evidence is limited. The letters that Grace wrote to her American friends describe the marriage from her perspective without providing transcripts of marital conversations, and Rainier's direct communications about the marriage are even more limited in the surviving record. What exists is inference from behavior, from the pattern of the letters, from the accounts of people who observed the household at close range, and from the specific choices each of them made in the years after the marriage ended. The separate bedrooms arrangement, which Jeffrey Robinson's cooperation-based account notes as established in the later years of the marriage, is the detail the tabloid press has worked hardest to turn into evidence for its preferred narrative about the marriage's collapse. The effort requires ignoring the specific social context. Separate bedrooms in European aristocratic marriages of the 20th century were not an unusual accommodation. The physical organization of palace buildings, with their formal suites and official apartments designed for separate function rather than domestic intimacy, frequently produced separate sleeping arrangements as a practical matter. The arrangement tells you something about the practical organization of the household in the later years. What it does not tell you, on its own, is anything determinate about the emotional content of the marriage. What the emotional content of the marriage in its later years actually was, is something that the people closest to both of them describe in terms that are consistently more equivocal than either the fairy tale or the tabloid version. They had become, by the late 1970s and early 1980s, 2 people running parallel operations from the same address, with areas of genuine shared concern and areas of genuine divergence that they managed through the mechanisms available to people who have been married long enough to know which arguments are worth having and which are not. This is a description of many long marriages between people who began as one thing and became, over 2.5 decades, something more complicated. It is not a particularly romantic description, and it is not a tragic one. It is an honest one, to the degree that honesty is possible in a marriage that left behind limited direct evidence of its private texture. There is one more detail that belongs in an honest account of this marriage and that does not fit cleanly into either the standard narratives. Grace Kelly, by several accounts, was a person who found it very difficult to ask for help. The specific form of self-reliance she had developed in the Kelly household, where the expression of difficulty was a form of weakness the household did not accommodate, persisted through her Hollywood years and through her palace years and into the last years of her life. She managed what she managed. She carried what she carried. She communicated the weight of it to her American friends in the specific indirect language of the letters that Quine describes, where the weight is present, but the explicit statement of it is missing. This is relevant to the Marnie withdrawal in a specific way. She withdrew from the project, publicly, in terms that made the Monegasque public's concerns and the diplomatic situation with France the operative reasons. She did not say, in any public statement or in any letter that has been made available to biographers, that her husband had vetoed the project and she had accepted the veto. She accepted the veto and framed the acceptance in terms that made it look like a decision rather than a capitulation. This is the behavior of someone who has been trained not to expose the gap between what she decided and what was decided for her, because exposing that gap would require asking for a sympathy she did not feel entitled to ask for. The same pattern appears in the letters to Quine about the palace isolation, where the loneliness is present in the letters without being named as loneliness, where the specific constraints on her movements and communications are described without being characterized as what they were, where the weight of the situation is communicated through the accumulation of specific details rather than through the explicit statement that she found the situation painful. Grace Kelly communicated in the language of someone who has never been given permission to say directly that something is hard. This does not mean she was without self-awareness. It means she had a specific set of tools for managing her experience, and that explicit complaint was not among them. The letters to Quine are, in their way, more revealing than an explicit account would be, because the specific details she chose to share communicate the texture of what she was managing in a way that the statement, "I am unhappy," never quite could. Judith Balaban Quine, who received and described these letters, was in a position to read them with the kind of attention that comes from knowing the person well enough to understand what was not being said directly. She had known Grace since before the marriage. She had been at the wedding. She had maintained a correspondence across the 26 years of the marriage that was sustained enough to constitute a primary source of real value for historians. Her account in The Bridesmaids is not a tell-all or an exposé. It is the account of a woman describing the letters of a close friend, and what it describes is a marriage that was more complicated and more costly than either the fairy tale or the tabloid version allows, communicated in the careful, composed language of a woman who had been trained to manage difficulty through discipline rather than disclosure. The 40 years of conspiracy theory that followed Grace Kelly's death have done something to the public memory of this story that deserves to be named directly before this video ends. The conspiracy industry has made it nearly impossible to think about Grace Kelly's death as what it was: a medical event on a mountain road, a stroke in a car, an outcome that required no malice and no cover-up to produce, and that was turned into the appearance of a cover-up by a husband's inability to use truthful language in his first press statement about something unbearable. The conspiracy theories have added a layer of manufactured complexity to a story that already contained enough genuine complexity to occupy 2.5 hours without any additions. The genuine complexity is the story worth telling. The manufactured complexity is the story that has been doing most of the selling. A brake-tampering mafia murder narrative, or a teenager drove the car narrative, is easier to tell and easier to sell than an honest account of what the marriage actually was, because the honest account requires the audience to hold complexity without resolving it, to sit with a picture that contains both Rainier's controlling management of Grace's schedule and his 23 years of grief after her death. Both the engineering of the marriage by Onassis and Father Tucker and the real warmth that the letters show was present in it, both the Marnie veto and the Red Cross presidency, both the separate bedrooms of the later years and the front pew of the cathedral on September 18th. The conspiracy theories offer an escape from that complexity. They simplify the story in the direction of clarity. They give the audience a villain and a victim in unambiguous terms, and they tie the ending to the villainy. They are not true. They are, however, a more comfortable version of the story than the one the documentary record produces. The documentary record produces something more interesting and more lasting than comfort. It produces the actual account of two specific people in a specific situation, managing it with the resources they had available across 26 years, at costs that were real on both sides and that the simplified versions have systematically underweighted. Grace Kelly gave up more than the fairy tale admits and received less than it promises. She also built more than the decline narrative allows, and did so with a professional seriousness that the evidence consistently supports. Rainier imposed more than the fairy tale acknowledges, and grieved more completely than the tabloid version can account for. These statements are not contradictions, they are the actual shape of the marriage. The marriage of Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier III was engineered at its beginning, for reasons that were partly romantic and largely institutional. It ran for 26 years, across a set of structural asymmetries that expressed themselves through control and isolation, and a career-ending veto. It produced real achievements in philanthropic and cultural institution building that outlasted both of them. It ended with a man unable to perform composure at a state funeral and unwilling to replace the person he had lost for the remaining 23 years of his life. That is what the record shows. All of it is true simultaneously. The marriage was not a fairy tale. It was also not a nightmare. It was a long marriage between two real people in a strange and specific situation, and it is more worth understanding honestly than it is worth simplifying in either direction. If you stayed with this video for the full 2.5 hours, thank you for your time and attention. Subscribe if you haven't already, leave a comment about someone you would like to see covered in a future video, and hit like if the research has been useful to you. It helps more people find this kind of work. I will see you in the next one. The middle years of the marriage, roughly 1965 through 1975, are the years the documentary record addresses most thinly, and the thinness is itself informative. These were the years after Stephanie's birth and before Caroline's Juno marriage, before the Edinburgh Festival readings began, and after the Marnie Depression had settled into the functional carrying on that the operational records of the Red Cross and AMA document. They were years without a dramatic external event to organize the biography around. The treaty problem was solved. The de Gaulle crisis was resolved, after considerable negotiation, by 1963. The Onassis buyout was proceeding through the decade. The children were in school. The principality was stable and growing. The official schedule continued. The letters to Quine continued. What Grace Kelly's days actually looked like in Monaco in 1967, or 1970, or 1972, is something that the biographical literature reconstructs more from the pattern of the official record than from direct contemporary account. She attended the Red Cross board meetings, she appeared at the Grand Prix, she hosted state dinners, she managed the children's schedules and the palace's domestic administration, she corresponded with her American friends, she made visits to the United States, the number and duration of which were limited by Rainier's management of her travel calendar, in the ways that the primary sources document. She was building, in this period, the organizational infrastructure of Amadei that would produce its UN consultative status by the late 1970s. She was doing this work without the resources that a major international NGO typically has at its founding, because she was doing it from Monaco, which is a principality of 22,000 people with a single industry economy, rather than from Geneva or New York. That she produced, from this base, an organization that achieved UN consultative status and operates internationally in the 21st century is a specific and concrete achievement. The 1970s brought, alongside the Edinburgh Festival beginnings and the flower art, a particular kind of middle-aged reckoning that the biographical literature tends to handle delicately because it touches on questions about Grace's emotional life in her late 40s and early 50s that the sources address incompletely. She had been in Monaco for 15 years by 1971. She had been a princess for 15 years. The initial adjustments had long since been made. The marriage had found whatever stable form it was going to find. The children were growing into their teenage complications. And Grace was the age her mother had been when Grace was a child, which is the age at which many people begin to understand their parents differently than they had before. What is documented from this period is the sustained engagement with the charitable work and the emerging arts practice, and the American friends who remained in active correspondence. What is not fully documented is the interior texture of a woman who had given up more than the culture that watched her had understood she was giving up, and who had spent 15 years building what she could within the constraints of what she had given it up for, and who was arriving at midlife in a position that was, in many measurable respects, extraordinary, and in other measurable respects, a long way from the life she had been building in Manhattan and Hollywood before May 6, 1955. The Monegasque court had, over 15 years, come to accept Grace in a way it had not accepted her in the beginning. The initial probationary assessment had eventually resolved in her favor, partly because she had demonstrated over time that she understood and respected the codes the court cared about, and partly because the practical achievements of the Red Cross work and the cultural program were visible enough that the court could not pretend they hadn't happened. She had earned, through sustained work over a sustained period, the acceptance that the court had withheld on arrival. This is not a small thing. It is also not a thing she should have been required to earn from people who lived in a country her presence had helped keep solvent. The Amadei work brought Grace into contact with children's welfare advocates and international development professionals across multiple continents, and those contacts gave her, by the early 1970s, a professional network that was genuinely international, in the working sense rather than in the diplomatic sense of the palace's official relationships. She attended conferences. She met researchers and administrators and practitioners who were doing the operational work of child welfare protection in countries where the conditions were considerably more difficult than Monaco's, and she engaged with their work at the level of someone who had been thinking seriously about it for a decade and who had the organizational authority to do something concrete about it. The network she built through Amadei was different from any network she had had before Monaco, different from the Hollywood network, and different from the palace's social circuit, and it was the network through which she was most comfortable operating in the final years of her life. The Swedish visit in early September 1982, the last public appearance before the crash, was an Amadei engagement. She was there as the organization's founder and president, participating in work she had been doing for nearly 20 years, in a professional context that had nothing to do with Monaco's official ceremonial life, and everything to do with the second identity she had built inside the constraints the palace imposed. She flew back to Monaco. She drove up to Roquegel. She put Stephanie in the passenger seat. The morning of September 13, 1982, was an ordinary morning on an extraordinary road. Nothing about what happened on it required a conspiracy to produce. The stroke, the crash, the death. These are the outcomes of a medical event that occurs without malice and without planning in people across all circumstances and all levels of institutional protection. What the palace's false press statement did was transform an ordinary medical catastrophe into the appearance of something requiring explanation, and the conspiracy industry has been providing explanations 40 years on, without arriving at any that the evidence supports. The evidence supports what happened: a 52-year-old woman with a history of cardiovascular risk factors, whose medical records are not fully public, but whose age and stress history are documented, suffered a small stroke while driving a car on a winding mountain road. The stroke caused the crash. The crash caused her death. The palace could not say this clearly on the afternoon of September 13th, because the man who needed to authorize the saying of it was sitting in a hospital chair and was not yet capable of authorizing anything that required him to accept what he was being told. So the palace said something easier. The easier thing was false. The false thing created 40 years of conspiracy, and the conspiracy has, for 40 years, obscured the actual story, which is complicated enough, and true enough, and human enough, to occupy 2.5 hours without any manufactured additions. The woman in the car on September 13, 1982, the morning it happened, was the same woman who had been in the car at Cannes in May of 1955, who had been in the palace in April of 1956, who had been in the Hitchcock production offices in 1962, who had been at the Red Cross board meetings and the Amadei conferences and the Edinburgh Festival and the Paris Gallery openings and the Stockholm event the previous week. She was the woman the primary sources describe across 26 years, and she was not the woman the fairy tale describes, and not the woman the tabloid version requires. She was, right up until the stroke on the mountain road, working. She was in the middle of things. There was more she intended to do. That is where the story ends, on a road above the Mediterranean in September sunlight, with more to do. And what Rainier did for the 23 years after that is the last evidence available about what the marriage had actually been.